Those massive stone heads with their mysterious smiles have watched over the jungles of Mexico for 3,000 years. Each one weighs as much as 4 elephants, carved from single blocks of volcanic rock that ancient people somehow moved across 60 miles of swampland without wheels or beasts of burden. These are the faces of the Olmecs, the mother culture of all Mesoamerica, the civilization that gave birth to writing, the calendar, and the sacred bull game in the Americas. In the steamy lowlands along the Gulf of Mexico, where the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco meet, something extraordinary began happening around 3,500 years ago. Small villages of farmers who had been living simple lives for generations started coming together in ways never seen before in the Americas. They began building massive earthen pyramids that reached toward the sky. They carved monuments so large that even today, with all our modern machinery, we marvel at how they accomplished such feats. They developed ideas about the universe, about gods and spirits, about kingship and power that would echo through every civilization that came after them in Mexico and Central America. The land where the Olmecs flourished seems an unlikely place for civilization to bloom. During the rainy season, which lasts from May through November, the rivers overflow their banks and turn vast areas into shallow lakes. The air becomes so humid that breathing feels like swimming. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds thick enough to darken the sun. Poisonous snakes hide in the tall grass. Jaguars prowl through the forests at night. Yet this challenging environment also offered incredible richness. The flooding rivers deposited fresh, fertile soil across the floodplains year after year. Fish filled the streams and lagoons. Wild game roamed the forests. Fruits and nuts grew abundantly on trees that never knew winter's touch. The Olmecs learned to read this landscape like a book. They knew when the floods would come and when they would recede. They understood which plants would grow in which soils, which animals moved through which territories at which times of year. They discovered that the same floods that could destroy also brought life, that the same jungles that harboured dangers also provided abundance. From this deep knowledge of their environment, they built something unprecedented in the Americas, a complex civilization with monumental architecture, sophisticated art, long-distance trade networks, and religious and political systems that would influence cultures across Mesoamerica for the next 3,000 years. When we speak of the Olmecs, we're actually using a name they never called themselves. The word comes from the Nahuatl language spoken by the Aztecs many centuries later, and it means rubber people, referring to the rubber trees that grow in the region, and the rubber balls the Olmecs made for their ritual bull game. We don't know what the Olmecs called themselves because we cannot fully read their writing system, one of the earliest in the Americas. Their true name, like so many aspects of their culture, remains one of history's mysteries. The story of the Olmecs unfolds across roughly 1,500 years, from about 1500 BCE to 400 BCE, though their influence extended far beyond these dates. Archaeologists divide this vast span into 3 main periods, each marked by different centres of power and cultural developments. The early formative period, from 1500 to 900 BCE, saw the rise of San Lorenzo, the first great Olmec centre. The middle formative period, from 900 to 400 BCE, witnessed the flourishing of La Venta, perhaps the most impressive of all Olmec sites. The late formative period, from 400 BCE onward, saw the emergence of Tres Zapotes and the gradual transformation of Olmec culture into something new, as their ideas and innovations spread throughout Mesoamerica and evolved in different directions. But these neat divisions that archaeologists create don't capture the living, breathing reality of Olmec civilization. Imagine walking through San Lorenzo at its height around 1000 BCE. The morning mist rises from the river as the sun climbs above the jungle canopy. Already, Hundreds of people move through the plazas and courtyards of this artificial plateau that rises 160 feet above the surrounding landscape. This entire massive platform, covering more than 200 acres, was built by human hands, basket by basket of earth carried and placed over generations. On top of this human-made mountain, pyramids and platforms create a sacred landscape that mirrors the Olmecs' understanding of the cosmos. In the central plaza, workers carefully tend to one of the colossal heads, cleaning moss from its surface with brushes made from plant fibres. This particular head, which we now call Monument 1, shows a ruler who lived centuries ago, his face captured in basalt with such skill that you can see the individual wrinkles around his eyes, the slight downturn of his mouth, the distinctive shape of his nose that marks him as an individual, not just a type. He wears a helmet that might have been used in the ball game, its chin strap carved with symbols whose meaning we can only guess at. His eyes, wide and staring, seem to look through you rather than at you, as if seeing into another world. The creation of these colossal heads represents one of the great achievements of ancient engineering. The basalt from which they're carved comes from the Tuxtla Mountains, more than 60 miles away. Each rough block that would become a head weighed between 20 and 40 tons before carving even began. The Olmecs had no wheeled vehicles. The wheel was known in Mesoamerica only as a toy, never used for transportation. They had no draft animals, no horses, oxen, or donkeys existed in the Americas. Yet somehow they moved these massive stones across rivers, through swamps, over hills, and through dense jungle to their final destinations. Recent experiments suggest they might have used a combination of wooden rollers, rope, and human muscle power, with hundreds or even thousands of people working together to move each stone. They probably waited for the dry season, when the ground was firmer and rivers were lower. They might have used rafts to float the stones partway on rivers and seasonal floods. But even with these techniques, moving a 40-ton boulder 60 miles through jungle terrain would have taken months of coordinated effort, requiring not just physical labour, but sophisticated planning, organisation, and leadership. Once the stones arrived at their destination, master sculptors went to work. Using nothing but stone tools, hammerstones, chisels, and grinding stones, they slowly revealed the faces hidden within the basalt. This process might have taken years for each head. The sculptors had to understand not just the techniques of working stone, but the nature of basalt itself, how it fractures, where its weak points lie, how to work with its grain rather than against it. They had to maintain perfect proportions while working on a massive scale. A mistake could ruin years of work and waste one of these precious stones that had taken such effort to transport. The faces they carved were not generic or idealized. Each one shows a distinct individual with unique features. Some have broad noses and full lips. Others have narrower features. Some look young and vigorous. Others show the lines and weight of age. Most researchers believe these represent rulers, each one a portrait of a specific king who ruled at San Lorenzo or other Olmec centres. The helmets they wear might indicate their role as players in the ritual ball game, or they might be symbols of warfare and military leadership. Some scholars see in these heads evidence of African features and use this to argue for ancient contact between Africa and the Americas, though most archaeologists believe the features simply reflect the natural variation in the indigenous population of the region. Beyond the colossal heads, San Lorenzo was filled with other monuments and sculptures that reveal the complexity of Olmec society and belief. Massive stone thrones, which archaeologists once called altars before realizing their true function, show rulers seated in cave-like niches, often holding rope that binds captives or children. These thrones weigh up to 40 tons and demonstrate that the colossal heads were not unique achievements, but part of a broader tradition of monumental stone sculpture. The scenes carved on these thrones tell stories we can only partially understand. A ruler emerging from a cave that might represent the underworld, figures that might be ancestors or gods, symbols that might record historical events or mythological tales. The Olmecs also carved smaller sculptures with incredible skill and artistry. Jade figurines, some only a few inches tall, show human figures in various poses and conditions. Some appear to be swimmers or dancers. Others show figures with deliberately deformed heads, a practice the Olmecs and later Mesoamerican cultures used to mark elite status by binding infant skulls to create elongated shapes. Many figurines combine human and animal features, particularly those of the jaguar, creating what archaeologists call were-jaguars, beings that seem caught in the moment of transformation between human and animal form. These were-jaguar figures provide our clearest window into Olmec religious thought. The jaguar was the apex predator of their world, a creature equally at home in water, on land, and in trees, active both day and night, a master of all environments. The Olmecs seem to have seen in the jaguar a model of power and a bridge between worlds. Their art shows humans transforming into jaguars, and jaguars with human characteristics. Babies with jaguar features appear frequently, perhaps representing the offspring of unions between human and divine jaguar ancestors. This concept of transformation, of beings that could shift between different states and worlds, would become central to Mesoamerican religion for thousands of years to come. The society that created these monuments was highly stratified, with clear distinctions between rulers, nobles, craftspeople, and farmers. At the top stood the ruler, who combined political and religious authority. The colossal heads themselves testify to the power these rulers wielded. Only someone with tremendous authority could command the resources necessary to create such monuments. Below the ruler were nobles who probably controlled different aspects of government, religion, and trade. Priests conducted the rituals that maintained the cosmic order. Master craftspeople created the objects that displayed and reinforced social hierarchies. Merchants managed the long-distance trade networks that brought jade from Guatemala, obsidian from the Mexican highlands, and other precious materials to Olmec centers. The majority of the population consisted of farmers who grew the corn, beans, and squash that fed everyone else. These farmers lived in small houses made of poles and thatch, much like rural houses in the region today. They worked small plots cleared from the jungle, using slash-and-burn techniques, moving to new plots every few years as the soil became exhausted. During the agricultural off-season, they probably provided the labour for monumental construction projects, moving earth to build platforms and pyramids, hauling stones for monuments, and performing the 1,000 other tasks necessary to maintain a complex society. The Olmecs' agricultural system was sophisticated and productive. They understood the complex ecology of their environment and developed techniques suited to local conditions. In addition to the staple crops of corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters because they grow well together, with beans adding nitrogen to the soil and climbing corn stalks while squash leaves shade the ground and retain moisture. They cultivated a wide variety of other plants. They grew chili peppers for flavouring and preserving food. They cultivated cotton for textiles. They tended groves of cacao trees, whose beans they ground into a frothy chocolate drink that only elites could consume. They managed forest resources, encouraging useful trees like ramon, whose nuts could be ground into flour, and sapodilla, whose sap produced chicle for chewing gum. The Olmecs also developed innovative techniques for farming the wetlands that surrounded their centres. They built raised fields called chinampas in swampy areas, piling up earth to create dry planting surfaces surrounded by canals. These raised fields were incredibly productive, yielding multiple harvests per year. The canals provided fish and turtles for protein, while aquatic plants could be used as fertilizer. This intensive agriculture could support much higher population densities than slash-and-burn farming alone, allowing the Olmecs to concentrate large numbers of people at their ceremonial centres. Water management was crucial to Olmec civilization. At San Lorenzo, archaeologists have discovered an elaborate system of stone drains and aqueducts, some of the earliest known in the Americas. These drains, constructed from hundreds of tons of carved basalt stones fitted together without mortar, channeled water through the site and may have had both practical and ceremonial functions. Some researchers believe they were used for ritual bathing or to create sacred pools. Others suggest they managed drainage during the rainy season. The sophistication of this system, with its carefully calculated slopes and joins, demonstrates the Olmecs' engineering expertise and their ability to organize large-scale public works projects. Trade was the lifeblood that connected Olmec centers to the wider Mesoamerican world. Olmec merchants travelled hundreds of miles to obtain the materials their society valued. From the mountains of Guatemala, they brought jade, the most precious stone in Mesoamerican culture, valued more highly than gold. From various highland sources, they obtained obsidian, volcanic glass that could be worked into tools sharper than modern surgical steel. From the Pacific coast, they gathered shells and stingray spines used in bloodletting rituals. From distant regions, they brought magnetite for mirrors, hematite for red pigment, and serpentine for sculptures. But the Olmecs didn't just import materials. They exported ideas, technologies, and finished goods. Olmec-style artifacts have been found throughout Mesoamerica, from central Mexico to El Salvador. Some of these were probably made by Olmec craftspeople and traded to distant regions. Others were local copies, suggesting that Olmec artistic styles and religious concepts were being adopted by other cultures. This spread of Olmec influence has led some scholars to call them the mother culture of Mesoamerica, though others argue for a more complex model of interaction and mutual influence among early Mesoamerican societies. The reach of Olmec influence can be seen at sites like Chalcatzingo in central Mexico, where local artists carved Olmec-style reliefs into cliff faces, showing figures seated in caves surrounded by rain clouds and vegetation. At Teopantecuanitlan in Guerrero, hundreds of miles from the Olmec heartland, builders constructed a ceremonial centre with Olmec-style architecture and monuments. These distant sites weren't Olmec colonies, but rather local societies that adopted and adapted Olmec ideas to their own needs and beliefs. The story of how the Olmecs emerged from earlier cultures remains one of the great puzzles of Mesoamerican archaeology. We know that people had been living in the Gulf Coast lowlands for thousands of years before anything we would recognize as Olmec culture appeared. These early inhabitants were simple farmers and fishers who lived in small villages, made pottery and grew crops. Then, seemingly suddenly around 1500 BCE, something changed. These scattered communities began organizing themselves in new ways, building larger settlements, creating monumental art, and developing the complex religious and political systems that would define Olmec civilization. The transformation didn't happen overnight, despite how it might appear in the archaeological record. For generations before the first colossal head was carved, changes were brewing in the social and economic foundations of Gulf Coast society. Population was growing as agricultural techniques improved and became more reliable. Some villages were becoming larger and more important than others, perhaps because they controlled particularly productive lands or important trade routes. Social differences were becoming more pronounced, with some families accumulating more wealth and power than others. Religious specialists were developing increasingly elaborate rituals and mythologies that required special knowledge and training to perform. Archaeological evidence from sites that predate San Lorenzo shows us glimpses of this transformation in progress. At a site called El Manatí, located near later San Lorenzo, archaeologists have discovered one of the most remarkable offerings ever found in Mesoamerica. In a spring at the base of a hill, the pre-Olmec and early Olmec peoples made offerings for nearly 2,000 years. They placed wooden sculptures in the water, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the spring. These wooden busts, the earliest known sculptures from Mesoamerica, show faces with the same distinctive features later seen in the colossal heads. Along with the sculptures, they offered rubber balls, jade axes, and even the bones of infants, possibly sacrificed to the gods of this sacred spring. The wooden sculptures from El Manatí are haunting in their preservation and artistry. Carved from ceiba and other tropical hardwoods, they capture individual faces with remarkable skill. Some show young people with smooth features. Others depict older individuals with wrinkled faces and distinctive expressions. The preservation of these wooden artifacts is almost miraculous. Wood normally decays quickly in tropical environments, but the spring's unique conditions kept them intact for 3,000 years. When archaeologists first uncovered them, the wood was still soft and had to be carefully treated with preservatives to prevent it from disintegrating upon exposure to air. These offerings tell us that many elements of Olmec religion were already developing before San Lorenzo rose to prominence. The sacred spring itself represents an early example of the cave and water symbolism that would become central to Olmec and later Mesoamerican religions. Caves and springs were seen as portals to the underworld, places where the human and divine worlds intersected. The rubber balls found in the spring confirm that the ball game, which would become one of the defining features of Mesoamerican civilization, was already being played in this early period. The infant bones, disturbing as they are to modern sensibilities, show that human sacrifice, particularly of children, was already part of religious practice. The transition from these early ceremonial sites to the urban complexity of San Lorenzo represents a quantum leap in social organization. San Lorenzo wasn't just bigger than earlier sites, it was fundamentally different in conception and execution. The entire site was planned and built as a unified project, not something that grew organically over time. The massive platform on which it sits required moving millions of cubic meters of earth, a project that would have taken thousands of workers years to complete. This wasn't something a loose confederation of villages could accomplish. It required central planning, sustained coordination, and the authority to command labour on an unprecedented scale. The question of why this transformation happened when and where it did has fascinated archaeologists for decades. Some point to environmental factors. The period around 1500 BCE saw climatic changes that might have made agriculture more productive in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Rivers might have changed course, creating new fertile floodplains. Population pressure might have forced communities to organise more efficiently to manage resources. But environmental factors alone can't explain the cultural explosion that created Olmec's civilization. Many regions experience similar environmental conditions without developing comparable complexity. Others emphasize social and ideological factors. Perhaps a charismatic leader or group of leaders emerged who could unite disparate communities under a new religious or political vision. The emphasis on transformation in Olmec art, humans becoming jaguars, mortals becoming divine, might reflect a new ideology that justified social hierarchy and political centralization. The ruler wasn't just a political leader, but a shamanic figure who could traverse the boundaries between worlds, ensuring prosperity and cosmic order through their ritual performances and sacrifices. Trade might have played a crucial catalyzing role. The Gulf Coast lowlands sat at the intersection of multiple trade routes, connecting the highlands with the coasts, the north with the south. Controlling these trade routes would have brought wealth and exotic goods that could be used to display and reinforce social status. The jade, obsidian, and other precious materials that flowed through Olmec centers weren't just luxury items. They were essential tools for creating and maintaining social hierarchies. A ruler who could distribute jade axes to subordinates or sponsor the creation of elaborate jade figurines could build networks of obligation and loyalty that translated into political power. The early phases of San Lorenzo, dating from around 1500 to 1200 BCE, show a society in the process of inventing itself. The first structures were relatively modest, earthen platforms and simple buildings. But already, the Olmecs were experimenting with monumental sculpture. Some of the earliest colossal heads might date to this period, though dating these monuments is difficult, since stone can't be directly dated using radiocarbon techniques. Archaeologists must rely on the contexts in which monuments are found, which can be complicated by the Olmec practice of moving and recarving monuments over time. The layout of early San Lorenzo reveals careful planning and symbolic organization. The site wasn't just a random collection of buildings and monuments, but a carefully designed sacred landscape. The central axis of the site runs north-south, possibly aligned with astronomical phenomena. Platforms and pyramids create a series of nested sacred spaces, with access probably restricted based on social status and ritual role. The arrangement of monuments seems deliberate, creating sight lines and processional routes that would have structured how people moved through and experienced the site. One of the most intriguing features of early San Lorenzo is the presence of what appear to be massive buried sculptures. Using magnetometry and other remote sensing techniques, archaeologists have detected large basalt objects buried deep beneath the site's surface. Some of these might be colossal heads or other monuments that were deliberately buried, perhaps as part of termination rituals when rulers died or dynasties changed. Others might be unfinished sculptures, abandoned for unknown reasons and covered by later construction. These buried monuments remind us how much of Olmec culture remains hidden, waiting to be discovered. The population that supported San Lorenzo during its early phase probably numbered in the thousands, with most people living in scattered settlements throughout the surrounding countryside. These rural settlements ranged from single-family homesteads to small villages of a few dozen houses. Archaeological surveys have identified hundreds of these sites, creating a picture of a densely populated landscape organized around the ceremonial center. The relationship between the center and its hinterland was complex and reciprocal. The rural population provided food, labor, and raw materials to the center. In return, they received access to rituals, markets, and the protection that came from being part of a larger political entity. Daily life in these early settlements followed rhythms that would have been familiar to farmers throughout Mesoamerica. The agricultural cycle dominated the year, with intense periods of work during planting and harvest separated by slower periods when other activities could be pursued. During the dry season from December to May, farmers cleared new fields by cutting and burning vegetation. When the rains came in late May or June, they planted corn, beans and squash in the ash-enriched soil. Through the rainy season, they weeded and tended their crops, protecting them from pests and performing rituals to ensure adequate but not excessive rainfall. Harvest came in November and December, a time of celebration and thanksgiving if the crops were good, anxiety and hardship if they failed. But agriculture was only part of the subsistence system. The rivers, lakes, and swamps of the Gulf Coast lowlands provided abundant protein in the form of fish, turtles, and waterfowl. Archaeological evidence shows that the Olmecs consumed a wide variety of aquatic species, from tiny minnows to massive gar that could grow 6 feet long. They developed specialized techniques for catching different species, nets for small fish, spears and harpoons for larger ones, traps for turtles and crustaceans. During certain seasons, when fish concentrated in shrinking pools or migrated up rivers to spawn, entire communities might have participated in communal fishing expeditions. Hunting provided another source of protein and raw materials. The forests around San Lorenzo were home to deer, peccaries, tapirs, monkeys, and numerous smaller mammals. The Olmecs hunted with spears, atlatls, and possibly blowguns, though no direct evidence of blowguns has survived. They used every part of the animals they killed: meat for food, hides for clothing and containers, bones for tools, antlers for ritual objects. Certain animals had special significance beyond their practical value. Jaguar pelts and teeth were symbols of power worn by rulers and nobles. Quetzal feathers from birds hunted or traded from the highlands adorned headdresses and ceremonial costumes. The material culture of these early Olmec settlements shows both continuity with earlier traditions and innovative developments. Pottery evolved from simple utilitarian vessels to elaborate forms decorated with complex symbols and imagery. Early Olmec potters developed distinctive styles that would influence ceramic traditions throughout Mesoamerica. They created vessels in the shape of animals and humans, bottles with stirrup spouts that prevented evaporation, and elaborate incense burners for religious ceremonies. Some vessels were so finely made and decorated that they must have been reserved for elite use or special occasions. The development of craft specialization was crucial to the emergence of Olmec civilization. In earlier village societies, most families produced most of what they needed, but as San Lorenzo grew, specialized craftspeople emerged who devoted themselves full-time to particular skills. Master sculptors spent years learning to work basalt and jade. Skilled potters developed techniques for creating specific forms and decorations. Obsidian knappers produced tools of standardized forms and exceptional quality. These specialists probably worked under the patronage of rulers and nobles, creating the luxury goods that marked elite status and the ritual objects necessary for religious ceremonies. The organization of craft production at San Lorenzo reveals sophisticated economic planning. Workshops have been identified where particular activities were concentrated. In one area, archaeologists found evidence of obsidian tool production, with thousands of flakes and broken tools indicating intensive knapping activity. Another area shows evidence of ceramic production, with kilns, wasters, and tools for shaping and decorating pottery. These workshops weren't isolated, but integrated into the broader settlement, suggesting that craft production was closely controlled by political authorities. The emergence of writing, or at least proto-writing, during this early period represents one of the Olmecs' most significant contributions to Mesoamerican civilization. While we cannot fully read Olmec inscriptions, we can recognize that they were using symbols systematically to record information. The earliest examples are simple signs that might represent names, titles, or calendar dates. A cylindrical seal found at San Andres, dating to around 650 BCE, contains symbols that might represent early writing. Even earlier symbols appear on pottery and monuments, suggesting that the development of writing was a gradual process that began in the earliest phases of Olmec civilization. By 1200 BCA, San Lorenzo had transformed from an important regional center into something unprecedented in the Americas. A true city with monumental architecture, complex urban planning, and a population that might have reached 10,000 people or more. The site dominated the surrounding landscape both physically and symbolically, its pyramids and platforms visible for miles across the flat coastal plain. This was the beating heart of Olmec civilization during its first great flowering, a place where art, religion, politics and economics converged to create something entirely new in human history. The sheer scale of construction at San Lorenzo during this period defies easy comprehension. The central plateau covers more than 700 acres, all of it artificially modified, if not entirely human-made. Conservative estimates suggest that creating this plateau required moving at least 2 million cubic meters of earth. If we assume each worker could move 1 cubic meter per day, a generous estimate given the lack of wheeled vehicles or draft animals, this represents 2 million person days of labour just for the basic platform, not counting the pyramids, plazas, and other structures built on top. This massive investment of labour speaks to both the organisational capacity of Olmec rulers and the ideological motivation that inspired thousands of people to participate in such projects. The architecture of San Lorenzo wasn't just massive, it was sophisticated and carefully planned. Recent excavations have revealed that what appeared to be natural ridges and hills were actually artificial constructions, shaped to create a specific sacred landscape. The Olmecs modified natural features and created artificial ones to produce a built environment that embodied their understanding of cosmic order. The site's highest point, called the Group D Ridge, rises nearly 200 feet above the surrounding plain. From this summit, rulers could survey their domain and perform rituals visible to thousands of observers gathered in the plazas below. The planning of San Lorenzo shows remarkable attention to sightlines, acoustics, and movement patterns. Pyramids and platforms were positioned to create enclosed spaces with specific acoustic properties. A speaker standing in certain locations could be heard clearly throughout a plaza, while conversations in other areas would remain private. Processional routes connected different areas of the site, allowing for elaborate ritual performances that moved through space and time. The arrangement of monuments created visual narratives that reinforced political and religious messages. A visitor, approaching from the river, would first encounter colossal heads that established the power and antiquity of the ruling lineage, then move through increasingly sacred spaces, culminating in restricted areas where only priests and rulers could enter. Water features played a crucial role in the sacred landscape of San Lorenzo. In addition to the elaborate drainage system mentioned earlier, the Olmecs created artificial ponds and channels that might have served both practical and ritual purposes. Some researchers believe these water features were designed to create reflecting pools that mirrored the sky, bringing the heavens down to earth. Others suggest they were used for ritual bathing or as stages for ceremonial performances. The sound of flowing water would have added an auditory dimension to the sensory experience of the site, creating an atmosphere of constant movement and life even in the dry season. The famous colossal heads of San Lorenzo, 10 of which have been discovered so far, represent the apex of Olmec sculptural achievement during this period. Each head is unique, clearly representing a specific individual rather than a generalized type. Monument 1, the largest, stands nearly 10 feet tall and weighs approximately 25 tons. The smallest, Monument 10, is just under 5 feet tall but still weighs several tons. The faces they depict show a range of ages and expressions. Some appear young and vigorous, with smooth features and alert expressions. Others show the weight of age and responsibility, with sagging jowls and heavy eyelids. All wear elaborate helmets that might represent ball game equipment or military gear, possibly both, since warfare and the ball game were closely related in Mesoamerican thought. The creation of these heads required not just technical skill, but also deep cultural knowledge. The sculptors had to understand the conventions of royal portraiture, which features to emphasize, which to minimize, how to convey both individual identity and royal authority. They had to know the symbolic significance of every element, from the designs on the helmets to the shape of the ears. Recent studies using 3D scanning technology have revealed tool marks invisible to the naked eye, showing that Olmec sculptors used a sophisticated toolkit including chisels, hammers, drills, and abrasives. The final polishing of each head would have taken months of patient work, with increasingly fine abrasives, creating surfaces that still gleam after 3,000 years of exposure to the elements. But the colossal heads were just one element in a rich sculptural tradition at San Lorenzo. The site has yielded dozens of other monuments, from massive stone thrones to delicate jade figurines. The thrones, some weighing up to 40 tons, show complex scenes with multiple figures. Throne 4, for example, depicts a ruler emerging from a cave-like niche while holding a rope that binds a captive. The captive figure, shown much smaller than the ruler, might represent a defeated enemy or a sacrificial victim. Above the niche, carved designs might represent clouds and rain, suggesting the ruler's role in ensuring agricultural fertility. These thrones weren't just seats, but stages for ritual performances, with the carved scenes providing the mythological context for the ruler's actions. Smaller sculptures found at San Lorenzo reveal different aspects of Olmec society and belief. Jade figurines, some only inches tall, show remarkable attention to detail. Many depict figures with deliberately deformed skulls, a practice that marked elite status. Others show individuals with what appear to be genetic conditions, like dwarfism or cleft palates, which might have been seen as signs of divine favour or supernatural power. The famous were-jaguar figurines, showing beings that combine human and feline features, appear in various forms and sizes. Some show the transformation just beginning, with human faces developing fangs and claws. Others show it nearly complete, with fully feline bodies retaining only human postures or gestures. The symbolism of the jaguar transformation appears throughout Olmec art at San Lorenzo and speaks to fundamental beliefs about the nature of power and reality. Jaguars were the apex predators of the Olmec world, masters of forest, water, and night. They could climb trees, swim rivers, and see in darkness. Their spotted coats were thought to represent the stars, making them cosmic as well as earthly beings. Olmec rulers claimed the ability to transform into jaguars, gaining their power and transcending human limitations. This transformation might have been achieved through ritual practices involving hallucinogenic substances, sensory deprivation, bloodletting, or other techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness. The evidence for bloodletting and sacrifice at San Lorenzo comes from multiple sources. Stingray spines, shark teeth, and obsidian blades found at the site were tools for ritual bloodletting, a practice in which rulers and priests would pierce their tongues, earlobes, or genitals to offer blood to the gods. Ceramic vessels designed to catch blood have been found, some decorated with symbols that might represent specific deities or cosmic forces. Human remains found in ritual contexts suggest that human sacrifice, while probably not common, was practiced on special occasions. The victims might have been war captives, as suggested by the throne sculptures, or individuals specially chosen for sacrifice, possibly including children whose remains have been found in offering contexts. The ball game played at San Lorenzo was both sport and religious ritual, a cosmic drama in which players reenacted the movements of celestial bodies and the struggles between cosmic forces. The rubber ball, made from the latex of local rubber trees, mixed with the juice of morning glory vines to achieve the right consistency, could weigh several pounds. Players, wearing thick padding around their waists and hips, would try to keep the ball in motion without using their hands or feet. The game might have been played in formal courts with sloped walls, though no clear ball courts have been identified at San Lorenzo itself, possibly because they were built of perishable materials or located in areas not yet excavated. The religious and political significance of the ball game extended far beyond entertainment. The ball's movement through the court represented the sun's journey across the sky and through the underworld. Players might have represented different cosmic forces, day and night, life and death, order and chaos. The outcome of important games might have been seen as divine judgment, determining anything from agricultural success to the fate of war captives. Some scholars believe that losing players, or perhaps captains of losing teams, were sometimes sacrificed, their deaths ensuring the continuation of cosmic cycles. The helmets worn by rulers in the colossal heads might identify them as ball players, suggesting that skill in the game was one source of royal legitimacy. Daily life at San Lorenzo during its height was structured by overlapping cycles, agricultural, ritual, and political. The agricultural calendar determined when most people worked in the fields and when they were available for construction projects or craft production. The ritual calendar, based on astronomical observations, determined when ceremonies were performed, when sacrifices were made, when rulers performed public rituals. The political calendar of tribute collection, military campaigns, and diplomatic visits added another layer of temporal organization. These different cycles intersected in complex ways, creating a rich texture of social life that varied by season, status, and occupation. For the common farmers who made up the majority of the population, life revolved around their agricultural plots and family compounds. Houses were typically rectangular structures made of poles and thatch, raised on low earthen platforms to protect against flooding. A typical family compound might include 2 or 3 houses arranged around a central patio, with storage structures, work areas, and kitchen gardens. Extended families lived close together, sharing labour and resources. Women prepared food, made pottery, wove textiles, and tended gardens. Men worked the main agricultural fields, hunted, and participated in construction projects. Children helped with age-appropriate tasks while learning the skills they would need as adults. The diet of common people consisted mainly of corn, beans, and squash, supplemented with fish, small game, and gathered plants. Corn was prepared in various ways: ground into meal for tortillas and tamales, boiled for pozole, or fermented for alcoholic beverages. Beans provided essential protein, while squash seeds were ground for sauces. Chili peppers added flavour and important vitamins. Fish and shellfish from rivers and lagoons were preserved by smoking or salting for consumption during seasons when fresh catch was unavailable. Wild plants like amaranth, chia, and various fruits provided dietary variety and important nutrients. Elite diet and lifestyle at San Lorenzo differed markedly from that of commoners. Nobles had access to a wider variety of foods, including large game animals like deer and tapir, exotic items obtained through trade, and specially prepared dishes that required elaborate preparation. Cacao, consumed as a frothy bitter drink, often flavoured with chili or honey, was restricted to elite consumption. Certain cuts of meat from sacrificial animals might have been reserved for nobles and priests. Elaborate feasts reinforced social hierarchies with seating arrangements, serving order, and food distribution, all carefully orchestrated to display and reinforce status differences. The houses of elites were larger and more elaborate than those of commoners, though few have been excavated at San Lorenzo itself. Based on evidence from other Olmec sites and later Mesoamerican practices, elite residences probably featured stone foundations, plastered walls, and multiple rooms arranged around interior courtyards. They would have contained specialized spaces for different activities, sleeping quarters, reception areas for receiving visitors and conducting business, storage rooms for valuable goods, and private ritual spaces for family ceremonies. Elite compounds might have included separate structures for servants, craftspeople, and guards. Craft production at San Lorenzo during its peak was highly organized and specialized. Different workshops focused on different materials and products. Obsidian workshops produced both utilitarian tools and elaborate ritual objects. The knappers who worked obsidian developed incredible skill, creating blades so thin they were translucent and eccentrics, elaborately shaped ritual objects that demonstrated technical mastery. Jade workers used string saws, drills, and abrasives to shape this incredibly hard stone into figurines, axes, and jewellery. The tools and techniques they developed were passed down through generations, creating traditions that would influence jade working throughout Mesoamerica. The pottery workshops of San Lorenzo produced an enormous variety of vessels for different purposes. Utilitarian wares for cooking and storage were mass-produced using efficient techniques. Fine wares for elite use required more time and skill, with elaborate decoration using incision, excision, and differential firing to create contrasting colours. Some vessels were made specifically for ritual use, incense burners shaped like mythological beings, offering bowls decorated with cosmic symbols, vessels for holding sacrificial blood. The standardization of certain vessel forms suggests centralized control over at least some ceramic production. Trade networks centered on San Lorenzo extended throughout Mesoamerica and possibly beyond. Olmec merchants, traveling by foot and canoe, established relationships with distant communities to obtain exotic materials and possibly to spread Olmec influence. These merchants weren't just traders but also diplomats and possibly missionaries, carrying not just goods but also ideas, technologies, and religious concepts. They might have established permanent trading posts in distant regions, creating Olmec enclaves that served as bases for further expansion of trade networks. The goods that flowed through San Lorenzo's markets would have created a vibrant, cosmopolitan atmosphere. Jade from Guatemala, obsidian from various highland sources, shells from both coasts, colourful feathers from the tropical birds, pelts from jungle animals, amber from Chiapas, iron ore for mirrors from Oaxaca. All these and more passed through Olmec hands. In exchange, the Olmecs might have exported finished goods, like carved jade objects, rubber balls, textiles, and possibly perishable items like cacao or other tropical products that wouldn't survive in the archaeological record. The political organization of San Lorenzo remains partially mysterious, but evidence suggests a complex system combining elements of kingship, theocracy, and perhaps council governance. The ruler, whose portraits we see in the colossal heads, clearly held supreme authority. But he didn't rule alone. Carved monuments show other figures who might represent nobles, priests, or military leaders. The complexity of administration required to manage construction projects, organize trade, conduct rituals, and maintain order suggests a sophisticated bureaucracy with specialized officials responsible for different aspects of governance. Succession practices at San Lorenzo might have followed bloodline inheritance, with rulership passing from father to son or through other kinship lines. But the emphasis on personal transformation and shamanic power in Olmec art suggests that inheritance alone might not have been sufficient. New rulers might have had to prove their ability to transform, to communicate with supernatural forces, to ensure cosmic order through ritual performance. The creation of a new colossal head might have been part of the legitimation process, establishing the new ruler's place in the line of divine kings stretching back to mythological ancestors. The military organization of San Lorenzo is evidenced by weapons, fortifications, and artistic depictions of warriors and captives. While the site itself doesn't show massive defensive walls, its location on an artificially raised plateau would have made it naturally defensible. Weapons found at the site include spear points, knives, and possibly clubs, though many weapons were probably made of perishable wood. The depictions of bound captives on thrones and other monuments suggest that warfare, or at least raiding for captives, was a regular activity. These captives might have been sacrificed in religious ceremonies, used as labour for construction projects, or incorporated into Olmec society as subordinate members. The religious life of San Lorenzo was rich and complex, involving public ceremonies that brought together thousands of participants and private rituals conducted by religious specialists. The major pyramids and plazas were stages for elaborate performances that might have lasted days. Processions of priests and nobles, wearing elaborate costumes and masks, would have moved through the ceremonial precincts. Music from drums, flutes, rattles, and other instruments would have accompanied dancing and singing. Incense from copal resin would have filled the air with fragrant smoke. At climactic moments, rulers might have appeared atop pyramids, transformed through costume and ritual into divine beings to perform bloodletting or sacrifice. The Olmec calendar system, which would later be refined by the Maya into one of the most accurate calendars ever created, was already developing at San Lorenzo. While we don't have clear inscriptions of dates from this early period, the orientation of buildings and the timing of rituals suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Olmecs tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets, using these observations to determine agricultural timing and ritual cycles. They might have already developed the 260-day ritual calendar that would become standard throughout Mesoamerica, based on the multiplication of 13, a sacred number, by 20, the number of digits, on human hands and feet. Mathematical concepts necessary for architecture, astronomy, and administration were well developed at San Lorenzo. The Olmecs understood geometry, as evidenced by the precise layouts of their ceremonial centres. They could calculate volumes for earth-moving projects and weights for transporting monuments. They might have already developed the bar and dot notation system, later used by the Maya, where a dot represented 1 and a bar represented 5. The concept of zero, one of the great intellectual achievements of Mesoamerican civilization, might have had its origins in Olmec mathematics, though direct evidence is lacking. The decline of San Lorenzo around 900 BCE remains one of the great mysteries of Olmec archaeology. The site wasn't gradually abandoned, but seems to have undergone deliberate destruction. Many monuments were defaced, with colossal heads and thrones showing evidence of intentional damage. Some were buried in lines or patterns that suggest ritual deposition rather than random destruction. The site continued to be occupied after this destruction, but it never regained its former prominence. Power shifted to other centres, particularly La Venta, which would become the greatest of all Olmec cities. Various theories have been proposed for San Lorenzo's decline. Environmental degradation might have played a role. Centuries of intensive agriculture could have exhausted soils, while deforestation might have led to erosion and flooding. Climate change around 900 BCE might have brought droughts or changes in rainfall patterns that disrupted agriculture. Social factors could have been important: internal conflicts between different factions, succession disputes, or popular uprisings against oppressive rulers. External pressures from competing centres or invading groups might have weakened San Lorenzo's power. The ritual destruction of monuments suggests that ideological factors were crucial in San Lorenzo's decline. The defacement wasn't random vandalism, but targeted specific features. Faces were mutilated, symbols were obliterated, but the monuments weren't completely destroyed. This pattern suggests an intentional effort to neutralize the supernatural power of these objects while preserving them as historical artifacts. Perhaps a change in dynasty or religious ideology required the ritual killing of monuments associated with the old order, or perhaps the destruction was carried out by enemies who wanted to eliminate San Lorenzo's spiritual power while demonstrating their own superiority. Despite its decline, San Lorenzo's influence continued long after its fall. The artistic styles developed there spread throughout Mesoamerica and continued to inspire artists for centuries. The religious concepts first articulated in its monuments and sculptures became fundamental elements of Mesoamerican belief systems. The model of sacred kingship established by its rulers influenced political organization throughout the region. Even in ruins, San Lorenzo remained a place of memory and possibly pilgrimage, a reminder of the achievements of the ancestors and the impermanence of human power. As San Lorenzo declined, a new centre rose to prominence in the Olmec world. La Venta, located on an island surrounded by swamps near the Tonelá River in modern Tabasco, would become the most spectacular of all Olmec sites. A sacred city whose monuments and architecture reached unprecedented heights of sophistication and symbolic complexity. For nearly 500 years, from about 900 to 400 BCE, La Venta stood as the paramount centre of Olmec civilization, a place where art, religion, and political power converged to create one of ancient America's most remarkable urban landscapes. The setting of La Venta was dramatically different from San Lorenzo. While San Lorenzo dominated a broad floodplain, La Venta occupied a narrow island just barely above the surrounding wetlands. This constrained setting forced the Olmecs to build upward rather than outward, resulting in the tallest pyramid in Mesoamerica at that time. The island location also gave La Venta a quality of separateness, of existing in a liminal space between land and water, earth and sky. This liminality might have enhanced its sacred character, making it an especially appropriate place for rituals involving transformation and communication between worlds. The plan of La Venta reveals a level of architectural sophistication and symbolic intentionality that surpasses anything seen at earlier Olmec sites. The entire complex stretches along a north-south axis for nearly 2 miles, with the major monuments concentrated in a ceremonial core covering about half a square mile. This north-south orientation, precisely aligned to 8 degrees west of magnetic north, might have had astronomical significance, possibly related to observations of stellar movements or the path of the sun at specific times of year. Every structure, plaza and monument was positioned according to this master plan, creating a unified sacred landscape that embodied Olmec cosmology. At the heart of La Venta stands Complex C, dominated by the Great Pyramid, a massive earthen mound that originally rose more than 100 feet above the surrounding plaza. For decades, archaeologists believed this pyramid had a rectangular base, like later Mesoamerican pyramids. But recent investigations have revealed that it was actually constructed with a circular or fluted cone shape, unique in Mesoamerican architecture. Some researchers believe this unusual form was meant to represent a volcanic cone, perhaps specifically the volcanoes of the Tuxtla Mountains, where the Olmecs obtained their basalt. Others suggest it might represent a cosmic mountain, the axis mundi connecting the underworld, earth, and heavens. The construction of the Great Pyramid required moving approximately 100,000 cubic meters of earth and clay, all carried in baskets by human labourers. The pyramid was built in phases over several centuries, with each phase carefully planned to maintain its distinctive shape while increasing its height. The surfaces were covered with coloured clays, red, yellow, purple and white, creating a polychrome effect that would have been visible for miles. These colours weren't randomly chosen but had symbolic significance, possibly representing different directions, seasons, or cosmic forces. The pyramid wasn't climbed via stairs but probably through a spiral ramp that wound around its surface, creating a ritual path that literally and symbolically ascended toward the heavens. North of the Great Pyramid lies Complex A, the most elaborate and enigmatic architectural ensemble at La Venta. This complex consists of two long, parallel mounds flanking a sunken court, creating an enclosed ceremonial space nearly 400 feet long. This massive mosaic, requiring hundreds of tons of imported stone, was created and then immediately buried, never meant to be seen by human eyes after its completion. This act of concealment speaks to Olmec concepts of sacred power. Some offerings were so potent they had to be hidden from ordinary sight. The practice of creating and then burying elaborate offerings was central to ritual life at La Venta. Archaeologists have discovered numerous caches of jade, serpentine, and other precious materials deliberately buried throughout the site. One of the most spectacular discoveries, known as Offering 4, consists of 16 figurines arranged in what appears to be a scene or tableau. 15 jade and serpentine figurines stand in a semicircle, apparently observing or confronting a single figure made of red granite. The scene might represent a ritual, a mythological event, or a historical incident. 6 jade celts, polished axes that had both practical and symbolic significance, were planted upright behind the figures like standing stones or stelae. What makes Offering 4 even more remarkable is evidence that the Olmecs returned to it after burial. About a century after the offering was first deposited and covered, someone dug down precisely to its location, examined the figurines without disturbing their arrangement, and then carefully reburied them. This suggests that the Olmecs maintained precise records or oral traditions about the location of buried offerings, and that these hidden caches continue to be spiritually active even when invisible. The act of revisiting might have been necessary to renew the offering's power or to consult it for divination purposes. The quartz floor was paved with serpentine blocks arranged in abstract patterns that might represent a stylized jaguar mask when viewed from above. This suggests that the Olmecs maintained precise records or oral traditions about the location of buried offerings, and that these hidden caches continue to be spiritually active even when invisible. The act of revisiting might have been necessary to renew the offering's power or to consult it for divination purposes. The massive stone sculptures of La Venta represent some of the finest achievements of Olmec art. 4 colossal heads have been found at the site, each one a portrait of a ruler who governed this sacred city. These heads, while similar in conception to those of San Lorenzo, show subtle stylistic evolution. The faces are somewhat more stylized, with greater emphasis on symbolic elements. The helmets are more elaborate, with complex designs that might encode names, titles, or historical information. The largest head at La Venta, Monument 1, weighs over 20 tons and shows a ruler with particularly distinctive features. A broad nose, thick lips, and eyes that seem to gaze into eternity. But the colossal heads are just one element in La Venta's rich sculptural program. Altar 4, one of the most complex Olmec monuments ever discovered, shows a ruler emerging from a niche that represents a cave or the mouth of the earth monster. He holds a rope that binds a captive shown on the side of the monument. Other figures, possibly ancestors or deities, appear on the sides and back of the altar. The entire monument creates a three-dimensional narrative that viewers would have experienced by walking around it, discovering new scenes and relationships between figures. This sophisticated use of space and narrative demonstrates that Olmec artists were thinking beyond simple representation to create complex visual stories. Stela 3, known as Uncle Sam, because of a beard-like element that early archaeologists thought resembled Uncle Sam's goatee, provides crucial evidence for understanding Olmec history and mythology. The stela shows two figures facing each other in what appears to be a ritual or diplomatic encounter. One figure wears an elaborate headdress with what might be a bird deity. The other has a more simple costume, but carries what could be ritual implements. Between them float several smaller figures or symbols that might represent ancestors, deities, or cosmic forces. The scene might depict a historical meeting between rulers, a mythological encounter between gods, or a ritual performance that combined both historical and mythological elements. The discovery of what appears to be an early writing system at La Venta has profound implications for understanding Olmec intellectual achievements. Several monuments bear symbols that go beyond simple pictorial representation to function as a form of notation. The Cascajal block discovered near La Venta, though not at the site itself, contains 62 symbols arranged in horizontal rows that strongly suggest a written text. While we cannot yet read this text, the symbols show standardization and patterning consistent with true writing. If confirmed as writing, this would make the Olmecs the inventors of the first writing system in the Americas, predating Maya writing by several centuries. The religious life of La Venta was complex and multifaceted, involving both public spectacles and esoteric rituals. The layout of the site created multiple performance spaces for different types of ceremonies. The Great Plaza south of the pyramid could accommodate thousands of participants in public festivals. The enclosed court of Complex A provided a more restricted space for elite rituals. Smaller platforms and enclosures throughout the site might have been used for specialized ceremonies related to different deities, seasons, or social groups. Water ritual played a particularly important role at La Venta. The site's location on an island surrounded by water made it an ideal place for ceremonies involving this sacred element. Several stone drains and aqueducts have been found that might have been used to channel water for ritual purposes. One elaborate drain constructed from carved basalt sections fitted together terminates in a stone vessel that might have collected sacred water. The Olmecs might have practiced ritual bathing, water sacrifice, or divination using water's reflective properties. The association of rulers with water control, seen in the drain systems of both San Lorenzo and La Venta, suggests that hydraulic engineering had both practical and symbolic significance. The ball game at La Venta took on new elaboration and significance. While no formal ball court has been definitively identified, the long narrow space of Complex A might have served this purpose. Several sculptures depict ball players or ball game equipment. Monument 27 shows a figure in the distinctive protective gear worn by ball players, a wide belt or yoke around the waist, padding on one arm, and an elaborate headdress. The rubber balls used in the game were produced from latex harvested from trees in the surrounding region, mixed with juice from morning glory vines, in a process that required specialized knowledge passed down through generations. The economy that supported La Venta's elaborate ceremonial life was based on intensive agriculture, supplemented by tribute from subordinate communities. The wetlands surrounding the site were transformed into highly productive raised fields. These chinampas, artificial islands built up from swamp muck and vegetation, could produce multiple crops per year. Canals between the raised fields provided fish, turtles, and other aquatic resources, while also serving as transportation routes. This intensive agriculture could support a much higher population density than slash-and-burn farming, allowing for the concentration of craftspeople, priests, and other specialists at the site. The craft production at La Venta reached new heights of technical and artistic achievement. Jade workers at the site produced some of the finest jade objects ever created in ancient America. The famous Kun's axe, now in the American Museum of Natural History, shows a were-jaguar figure carved with incredible detail despite the extreme hardness of jade. The figure's face combines human and feline features with such subtlety that the transformation seems to be captured at a specific moment. Every detail, from the fangs just beginning to emerge from the upper lip to the claws forming from human fingers, demonstrates complete mastery of both technique and iconography. The process of working jade at La Venta involved techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with Stone Age technology. Jade cannot be chipped like flint or obsidian. It must be slowly worn away using abrasives. Olmec craftspeople use string saws, cords embedded with sand or crushed stone, to cut jade blocks into rough shapes. They use tubular drills, probably made from hollow bird bones or bamboo, with abrasive sand to create circular depressions and perforations. Final polishing required weeks or months of patient work, with increasingly fine abrasives, ultimately achieving surfaces with mirror-like finishes that have survived 3,000 years. The organization of craft production at La Venta suggests centralized control and standardization. Workshops have been identified where specific activities were concentrated. In one area, thousands of obsidian blades and flakes indicate intensive tool production. Another area shows evidence of shell working, with cut and partially worked shells from both Atlantic and Pacific species. The standardization of certain artifact types, particularly ritual objects like jade celts and figurines, suggests that production was controlled by religious or political authorities who determined appropriate forms and iconography. Trade networks centered on La Venta extended even farther than those of San Lorenzo. Olmec-style artifacts from this period have been found from central Mexico to Costa Rica. Some of these were probably made at La Venta and exported. Others were local copies or adaptations of Olmec styles. The presence of La Venta-style monuments at distant sites like Chalcatzingo in Morelos and Teopantecuanitlan in Guerrero suggests more than casual trade contact. These sites might have been colonies, allied centres, or local polities that adopted Olmec ideology and symbolism to enhance their own authority. The nature of Olmec influence during the La Venta period has been debated by archaeologists for decades. Some see evidence of an Olmec empire, with La Venta as the capital controlling subordinate provinces through military force or economic dominance. Others argue for a more complex pattern of interaction, with local elites selectively adopting Olmec symbols and practices that enhanced their power while maintaining political independence. The truth probably involves elements of both models, with different regions experiencing different types and intensities of Olmec influence. The intellectual achievements of La Venta period Olmecs extended beyond art and architecture to include significant developments in science and mathematics. The bar and dot numerical system, later used by the Maya, was probably fully developed by this time. This vigesimal system, based on units of 20, allowed for complex calculations necessary for astronomy, architecture, and administration. The concept of zero as a placeholder, one of the crucial mathematical innovations in human history, might have been invented at La Venta, though direct evidence is lacking. Astronomical observations at La Venta reached new levels of sophistication. The precise orientation of the site's architecture suggests careful observation of celestial phenomena. The Olmecs tracked the movements of Venus, which would become central to Mesoamerican astronomy and mythology. They understood the solar year and its relationship to agricultural cycles. They might have observed and predicted eclipses, using these dramatic events to demonstrate the power of their priest astronomers. The correlation of celestial events with earthly rituals reinforced the rulers' claims to cosmic authority. The medical and botanical knowledge of La Venta's specialists must have been extensive, though little direct evidence survives. The plants used for medicine, ritual, and crafts required deep understanding of local ecology. The Olmecs knew which plants could heal and which could harm, which could alter consciousness and which could preserve food. They understood the breeding of crops like maize, selecting for desired characteristics over generations. They knew the secrets of processing toxic plants like manioc to make them edible. This practical knowledge, transmitted through apprenticeship and oral tradition, formed the foundation for later Mesoamerican science. The social organization of La Venta shows increasing complexity and stratification compared to earlier periods. At the apex stood the ruler, whose portrait appeared in colossal heads and whose authority derived from both political power and religious sanction. Below the ruler was an elaborate hierarchy of nobles, priests, warriors, administrators, and specialists. Each group had specific roles, privileges, and obligations. Sumptuary laws probably restricted access to certain materials, colours, and designs. Jade ornaments, quetzal feathers, and jaguar pelts were likely reserved for the highest elites. Even diet might have been regulated, with certain foods restricted to specific social groups or occasions. The role of women in La Venta society, while poorly understood due to limited archaeological evidence, was probably more complex than simple domestic subordination. Female figurines found at the site show women in various roles and contexts. Some appear to be engaged in ritual activities, possibly as priestesses or shamans. Others might represent goddesses or female ancestors. The emphasis on fertility in Olmec religion suggests that women's reproductive power was recognized and valued. Elite women probably played important roles in maintaining dynastic lines and political alliances through marriage. They might have controlled certain aspects of ritual life, particularly those related to fertility, childbirth, and domestic ceremonies. Children at La Venta experienced different upbringings depending on their social status. Elite children underwent cranial deformation, their skulls bound in infancy to create the elongated shape that marked high status. They probably received formal education in history, mythology, ritual practice, and possibly writing and mathematics. Common children learned practical skills through apprenticeship with their parents or other relatives. The high infant mortality rate, evidenced by numerous child burials, meant that perhaps only half of children survived to adulthood. Those who did survive childhood diseases and accidents entered adult roles early, with girls marrying in their early teens and boys taking on adult work responsibilities around the same age. As La Venta's power waned around 400 BCE, the torch of Olmec civilization passed to Tres Zapotes and other centres in what archaeologists call the late formative period. This era, lasting from roughly 400 BCE to 200 CE, saw not the collapse but the transformation of Olmec culture as its ideas and innovations spread throughout Mesoamerica and evolved in new directions. Tres Zapotes, located in the Tuxtla Mountains of southern Veracruz, became the most important Olmec site during this transitional period, a place where ancient traditions met new influences to create something both familiar and revolutionary. The setting of Tres Zapotes differed markedly from earlier Olmec centres. Instead of occupying lowland swamps or river islands, the site spread across rolling hills at the foot of the Tuxtla Mountains. This upland location provided direct access to the basalt sources that earlier Olmecs had to transport from great distances. It also placed Tres Zapotes at the intersection of trade routes, connecting the Gulf Coast with the Mexican highlands, the Pacific Coast, and the Maya region. This strategic position would prove crucial as Olmec culture evolved from a regional phenomenon into a pan-Mesoamerican influence. The layout of Tres Zapotes reflects changing concepts of urban planning and sacred space. Unlike the linear arrangement of La Venta or the concentrated plateau of San Lorenzo, Tres Zapotes consisted of 3 separate architectural groups spread over nearly 2 square miles. Each group had its own plazas, mounds, and monuments, suggesting a more decentralized political structure, or perhaps the coexistence of multiple elite lineages. The spaces between these groups were filled with residential areas, workshops, and agricultural fields, creating an integrated urban landscape, rather than a separated ceremonial centre. Group 1 at Tres Zapotes contained some of the site's most impressive architecture, including a large earthen mound over 90 feet tall. This mound, while smaller than La Venta's Great Pyramid, required substantial labour investment and indicates continued ability to mobilise large workforces. The arrangement of structures around formal plazas shows continuity with earlier Olmec architectural traditions, but new elements appear as well. Stone facing on some structures, a technique rare in earlier Olmec sites, suggests influence from or interaction with highland cultures, where stone architecture was more common. The monuments of Tres Zapotes demonstrate both continuity and innovation in Olmec sculptural traditions. 2 colossal heads have been found at the site, showing that this quintessentially Olmec monument type continued to be produced. But these heads show stylistic differences from earlier examples. The faces are more stylized, with less emphasis on individual portraiture and more on symbolic elements. The helmets are simpler, lacking the elaborate designs of La Venta examples. These changes might reflect different concepts of rulership, with less emphasis on the individual ruler and more on the office itself. Stela C from Tres Zapotes provides one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding the late Olmec period. One side of this monument bears a were-jaguar face in classic Olmec style, but the other side contains something revolutionary, a date in the long count calendar system that would later become central to Maya civilization. The date, corresponding to 32 BCE in our calendar, is one of the earliest long count dates ever discovered. This suggests that the Olmecs, not the Maya, might have invented this sophisticated calendar system that could track dates over thousands of years with a remarkable precision. The long count calendar represents a conceptual breakthrough in how humans think about time. Rather than relying on repeating cycles, as most calendars do, the long count created a linear progression of days from a fixed starting point. This allowed for precise historical record-keeping and long-term astronomical calculations. The intellectual sophistication required to develop such a system, understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and abstract thinking about time, demonstrates that late Olmec scholars were among the most advanced thinkers of their era. Another crucial discovery at Tres Zapotes is Monument J, also known as the Tuxtla statuette, though it was actually found near rather than at the site. This small jade figurine bears an even earlier long count date, 162 CE, along with what appears to be a hieroglyphic text. While we cannot fully read this text, it represents a clear development toward the writing systems that would flourish among the Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures. The combination of image, calendar date, and text on a single monument shows the integration of different communication systems that would become standard in later Mesoamerican cultures. The economy of Tres Zapotes and other late Olmec centers shows increasing diversification and specialization. Agriculture remained fundamental, but craft production and trade took on greater importance. The The proximity to basalt sources allowed Tres Zapotes to become a major producer of groundstone tools, metates and manos for grinding corn, axes for clearing forests, and various other implements. These utilitarian objects were traded throughout the region, providing a steady economic base beyond the luxury trade in jade and obsidian that had characterized earlier periods. Ceramic production at Tres Zapotes reached new levels of technical sophistication. Potters developed new firing techniques that allowed for greater control over color and hardness. They created new vessel forms, including elaborate incense burners with modeled figures, complex composite vessels with multiple chambers, and fine orange wares that would become characteristic of later periods. Some ceramic styles show clear influence from other regions, particularly the Maya area and the Mexican highlands, indicating increasing cultural interaction and exchange. The religious life of Tres Zapotes shows both continuity with earlier Olmec traditions and the emergence of new deities and rituals. The were-jaguar remained important, appearing on monuments and in portable art. But new supernatural beings appear as well, including what might be early versions of gods that would become central to later Mesoamerican religions. A feathered serpent, possibly an early form of Quetzalcoatl, appears on some monuments. A rain deity with goggle eyes, similar to the later Tlaloc, is depicted on ceramics. These new deities might represent the incorporation of religious concepts from other regions or the evolution of Olmec beliefs in response to changing social and environmental conditions. The bull game continued to be important at Tres Zapotes, with several sculptures depicting players and equipments, but the game seems to have taken on new meanings and associations. Yokes, the U-shaped stones worn around the waist during play, become more elaborate and are found in burial contexts, suggesting they had significance beyond their practical use. Palmas, paddle-shaped stones that might have been worn or carried during ceremonies related to the bull game, appear for the first time. These new artifact types would become characteristic of classic period Gulf Coast cultures, showing how Olmec traditions evolved into new cultural expressions. Social organization at Tres Zapotes and contemporary sites shows increasing complexity and possibly new forms of political organization. The decentralized layout of the site might reflect a more collective form of governance, with power shared among multiple elite lineages rather than concentrated in a single ruler. The absence of clear palace structures, in contrast to later Maya sites, suggests that political authority might have been more dispersed, or that rulers didn't maintain permanent residences at ceremonial centres. The evidence for warfare increases during the late Olmec period. More weapons appear in the archaeological record, including obsidian-edged clubs and spear points. Defensive features like walls and ditches are found at some sites. Artistic depictions of warriors and captives become more common and more explicit in their violence. This increase in warfare might reflect competition for resources as populations grew, conflict between different ethnic or linguistic groups, or the breakdown of earlier political structures that had maintained peace. Despite increasing conflict, trade networks during the late Olmec period expanded to cover even greater distances. Olmec-style artifacts from this period have been found as far south as Costa Rica and as far north as the Valley of Mexico, but the nature of this trade was changing. Rather than Olmec centers dominating exchange networks, multiple regions developed their own specializations and traded as equals. The Maya area was producing its own distinctive pottery and jade objects. Central Mexican sites were developing their own architectural and artistic styles. The Olmec heartland remained important but no longer dominant. The interaction between the Olmecs and the emerging Maya civilization during this period was particularly significant. Maya sites like El Mirador and Nakbe were growing into major centres with massive pyramids and sophisticated art. These sites show clear Olmec influence in their early phases, but quickly developed distinctive Maya characteristics. The relationship was probably reciprocal, with ideas and innovations flowing in both directions. The Maya adoption and elaboration of Olmec concepts like the long count calendar, hieroglyphic writing, and certain religious themes shows how Olmec culture provided a foundation for later Mesoamerican civilizations. The question of Olmec ethnicity and language becomes particularly complex during the late formative period. As Olmec culture spread and evolved, it was adopted by peoples of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. The original Olmecs probably spoke a Mixozoquian language based on linguistic reconstruction and the distribution of loanwords in other Mesoamerican languages. Words for cacao, ritual objects, and religious concepts that appear across multiple language families often trace back to Mixozoquian roots, suggesting this was the language of those who first developed and spread these cultural elements. But by the late formative period, Olmec had become more of a cultural tradition than an ethnic identity, practiced by peoples who spoke various languages and considered themselves members of different ethnic groups. The environmental challenges facing late Olmec centres differed from those of earlier periods. Centuries of intensive agriculture had depleted soils in some areas. Deforestation had led to erosion and changes in local climate. Rivers had changed course due to sedimentation, affecting transportation routes and agricultural systems. Population growth had put pressure on resources, requiring more intensive management strategies. These environmental stresses might have contributed to the decentralization of political power and the shift away from massive construction projects that characterized earlier periods. At Tres Zapotes, evidence suggests that the community developed new strategies for managing these environmental challenges. Terracing on hillsides prevented erosion while creating new agricultural land. Canal systems became more sophisticated, not just draining excess water, but storing it for dry season use. Forest management practices evolved from simple clearing to more selective harvesting that preserved useful trees while removing others. These adaptations show that the late Olmecs weren't simply declining, but actively responding to changing conditions with innovation and flexibility. The artistic production of the late Olmec period, while perhaps less monumental than earlier eras, shows remarkable diversity and creativity. Portable art objects become more common. Small jade pendants, ceramic figurines, carved shells that individuals could own and carry. These objects spread Olmec iconography and ideas far beyond the major centres. A jade pendant with an Olmec-style face found in a tomb in Costa Rica, a ceramic vessel with were-jaguar imagery from a highland Mexican site, a carved shell with Olmec symbols from a Maya burial. Each represents the diffusion and transformation of Olmec culture through individual choices and exchanges. And the production techniques for these portable objects show increasing standardization and efficiency. Workshops developed specialized tools and methods for mass-producing certain types of artifacts while maintaining quality. Molds were used to create identical ceramic figurines that could be traded widely. Templates guided the carving of jade pendants to ensure consistent proportions. This standardization didn't mean loss of creativity. Artists found ways to introduce individual variation within established forms, creating pieces that were both recognizably Olmec and uniquely expressive. The role of Tres Zapotes as a center of learning and knowledge preservation becomes apparent from the variety of monuments with calendrical and possibly textual information found there. The site might have functioned as something like a university or library, where knowledge from earlier Olmec centers was collected, preserved, and transmitted to new generations. Priest scribes, trained at Tres Zapotes, might have carried Olmec knowledge to other regions, establishing schools or scriptoria where local traditions merged with Olmec learning. The intellectual legacy of Tres Zapotes extends beyond calendrics and writing to include developments in mathematics and astronomy. The bar and dot notation system was fully developed by this time, allowing for calculations involving large numbers. The concept of place notation, where the position of a number determines its value, was understood and used. Astronomical observations had reached the precision necessary to predict eclipses and track the complex movements of Venus through its various phases. This knowledge wasn't just theoretical, but had practical applications in agriculture, navigation, and ritual timing. The medical and healing traditions of the late Olmecs, while poorly documented archaeologically, must have been sophisticated. The challenges of urban living, increased disease transmission, occupational injuries from craft production, the stresses of social stratification required specialized medical knowledge. Skeletal remains from Tres Zapotes show evidence of successfully healed fractures, dental work including filing and inlays, and surgical interventions like trepanation. The pharmacological knowledge necessary to perform such procedures, anesthetics, antibiotics, healing compounds, represents centuries of accumulated observation and experimentation. The treatment of the dead at Tres Zapotes and other late Olmec sites shows evolving concepts of afterlife and ancestry. While earlier Olmec burials were often simple, late formative burials become more elaborate and varied. Some individuals were buried with rich offerings, jade jewelry, ceramic vessels, obsidian tools, suggesting belief in an afterlife where such objects would be useful. Others were buried in unusual positions or locations that might indicate special status or circumstances of death. Secondary burial, where bones were removed from primary burials and redeposited elsewhere, becomes more common, possibly reflecting ancestor veneration practices. The discovery of a workshop area at Tres Zapotes where magnetite mirrors were produced provides insight into late Olmec technology and ideology. These mirrors, made from carefully polished iron ore, were probably used for divination and ritual purposes. The production process required precise knowledge of mineral properties and polishing techniques. The mirrors could produce clear reflections but also created distorted images that might have been interpreted as visions of other worlds or future events. The distribution of these mirrors throughout Mesoamerica shows that Tres Zapotes was producing ritual objects valued far beyond the Olmec heartland. The political history of Tres Zapotes, while impossible to reconstruct in detail, shows patterns of continuity and change. The site remained occupied and important for over 1,000 years, far longer than San Lorenzo or La Venta. This longevity suggests successful adaptation to changing circumstances rather than rigid adherence to traditional structures. The rulers of Tres Zapotes, whose names and deeds are lost to us, managed to maintain their centre's relevance as the political landscape of Mesoamerica transformed around them. The relationship between Tres Zapotes and emerging power centres in other regions was probably complex and varied over time. During some periods, Tres Zapotes might have been the dominant partner in regional alliances. At other times, it might have been subordinate to or allied with stronger polities. The presence of foreign pottery styles and architectural influences suggests that Tres Zapotes was open to external ideas rather than isolated or xenophobic. This cosmopolitan attitude might have been key to its longevity and continued relevance. The decline of Tres Zapotes and the end of distinctively Olmec culture around 200 CE wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation. The site continued to be occupied, but new architectural styles replaced Olmec forms. The production of colossal heads ceased, replaced by different types of monuments. Olmec religious imagery gave way to new iconographic systems. This transformation wasn't unique to Tres Zapotes, but occurred throughout the former Olmec region, as new cultures emerged from the foundation the Olmecs had established. The spiritual universe of the Olmecs was populated by powerful beings that combined human, animal, and supernatural characteristics in ways that challenged the boundaries between categories we consider distinct. Their religion wasn't simply a set of beliefs, but a comprehensive worldview that explained the origins of the cosmos, the nature of reality, the relationship between humans and the divine, and the obligations that bound all beings in a web of reciprocal exchanges. Through art, architecture, and ritual, the Olmecs created a sacred landscape where every stone, every plaza, every carved jade held spiritual significance and power. At the heart of Olmec religion stood the jaguar, but not the jaguar as simple animal. The Olmec jaguar was a cosmic principle, a divine ancestor, a model of transformation, and a mediator between worlds. In Olmec art, we see endless variations on the jaguar theme, fully animal jaguars with intelligent eyes that suggest consciousness beyond animal awareness, humans with jaguar features in various stages of transformation, jaguar human babies that might represent the offspring of primordial unions between human and divine, and abstract jaguar symbols reduced to essential elements like fangs, claws, and spotted patterns that could sanctify any object or space they adorned. The process of jaguar transformation, so central to Olmec religious thought, wasn't metaphorical, but was understood as literal shape-shifting that certain individuals could achieve through ritual practice. Shamanic specialists, possibly including rulers themselves, claimed the ability to transform into jaguars through techniques that might have included ingestion of hallucinogenic substances, sensory deprivation, bloodletting, fasting, and other methods for inducing altered states of consciousness. During these transformations, the shaman jaguar could travel between worlds, communicate with ancestors and deities, divine the future, and influence cosmic forces that affected human welfare. The substances used to achieve these transformative states were carefully guarded secrets, but archaeological and ethnographic evidence provides some clues. Bufo marinus toads, which secrete powerful hallucinogens from their skin glands, appear in Olmec art and were probably used in transformation rituals. Psilocybin mushrooms, which grow in the Olmec region and appear in later Mesoamerican religious contexts, might have been consumed. Morning glory seeds containing LSA, tobacco in concentrated doses that can induce visions, and possibly other plant psychoactives, were part of the Olmec pharmacopoeia. The knowledge of which substances to use, how to prepare them, what dosages were effective but not fatal, and how to guide the resulting experiences was specialized information transmitted through careful apprenticeship. The were-jaguar beings that appear so frequently in Olmec art represent various stages and types of transformation. Some show the moment of transformation beginning, a human face developing fangs, hands becoming claws, human consciousness expanding to encompass jaguar perception. Others show the transformation nearly complete, jaguar bodies retaining human posture or gestures that indicate retained human consciousness within animal form. The famous Las Limas figure, a young man holding a were-jaguar baby, might represent a shamanic specialist displaying his spiritual offspring, the result of his union with the jaguar spirit during transformation. But jaguars weren't the only significant animals in Olmec religion. Serpents, often shown with feathers or other supernatural attributes, represented the fluid, transformative powers of water and earth. The serpent's ability to shed its skin made it a natural symbol of renewal and transformation. Its movement between underground burrows, the Earth's surface, and water connected it to all three levels of the cosmos. Feathered serpents, combining the earthbound serpent with the celestial associations of birds, might represent an early form of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity that would become central to later Mesoamerican religions. Birds, especially raptors like eagles and hawks, represented the celestial realm and the ability to transcend earthly limitations. Harpy eagles, the most powerful raptors in the Olmec region, appear in art with their distinctive feather crests clearly depicted. These birds, which can take prey as large as monkeys and sloths, embodied predatory power in the sky realm equivalent to the jaguar's dominance on Earth. Bird transformation, while less common than jaguar transformation in Olmec art, appears in some contexts, suggesting that shamanic flight was part of religious practice. The Olmec cosmos was structured in layers, an underworld below, the earthly realm of human habitation, and celestial levels above. But these weren't separate, isolated realms. They were connected by various portals and passages. Caves, springs, and cenotes provided access to the underworld. Mountains, pyramids, and trees connected earth to sky. Certain locations where these connections were especially strong became sacred sites where temples and monuments were erected. The architecture of Olmec ceremonial centers recreated this cosmic structure, with pyramids representing mountains that reached toward the heavens and sunken courts representing entrances to the underworld. Water held special significance in Olmec cosmology as a transformative element that could exist in multiple states: liquid, vapor, ice, and moved between cosmic levels through rain, springs, and evaporation. The Olmec rain deity, possibly an early version of what would later become Tlaloc among the Aztecs or Chac among the Maya, appears in various forms in Olmec art. Sometimes shown as a supernatural being with jaguar features, sometimes as a more abstract entity represented by cloud symbols and raindrops. This deity controlled the rainfall essential for agriculture and thus for human survival. The Olmec underworld, while not as thoroughly documented as the later Maya Xibalba or Aztec Mictlan, was clearly conceived as a complex realm with its own geography, inhabitants, and rules. Caves were the primary entrances to this underworld, which might explain the cave-like niches in Olmec thrones, where rulers are shown emerging. These thrones might represent the ruler's ability to travel to the underworld and return, bringing back knowledge or power. The burial of precious objects, especially greenstone celts and figurines, might have been intended to establish spiritual connections with the underworld or to provide offerings to underworld deities. The practice of bloodletting, evidenced by stingray spines, obsidian blades, and other perforators found at Olmec sites, was central to religious ritual. Blood was the most precious offering humans could make to the gods, containing the life force that sustained both human and divine beings. Rulers and priests would pierce their tongues, earlobes, or genitals, allowing blood to drip onto bark paper that was then burned, sending the offering to the gods through smoke. The pain and blood loss induced altered states of consciousness that facilitated communication with divine beings. Scars from repeated bloodletting became marks of religious devotion and political authority. Human sacrifice, while not as extensively documented for the Olmecs as for later Mesoamerican cultures, was definitely practiced. The remains of sacrificed individuals, including children, have been found at Olmec sites. The sacrifice of children, disturbing as it is to modern sensibilities, might have been related to rain ceremonies, as children's tears were associated with rainfall in later Mesoamerican religions. Adult sacrificial victims might have been war captives, as suggested by bound figures shown on monuments, or individuals specially selected for sacrifice based on physical characteristics or spiritual qualities. The Olmec calendar system integrated astronomical observations with religious beliefs to create a complex temporal framework that structured both ritual and daily life. The 260-day ritual calendar, based on the multiplication of 13 and 20, both sacred numbers, determine the timing of ceremonies, the naming of individuals, and the interpretation of destiny. Each day had its own patron deity, associated qualities, and fortune. Children born on certain days were believed destined for specific roles or fates. This calendar wasn't just a way of tracking time, but a divination system that revealed the hidden influences shaping events. The solar calendar of 365 days tracked the agricultural year and the sun's journey through its annual cycle. The Olmecs understood that the solar year was actually slightly longer than 365 days and might have made adjustments to keep their calendar synchronized with astronomical reality. The movements of Venus, visible as both morning and evening star, were carefully tracked. Venus's cycle of disappearance and reappearance might have been associated with death and rebirth, themes central to Olmec mythology. Olmec creation mythology, while not preserved in written form, as later Maya and Aztec myths were, can be partially reconstructed from artistic representations and comparison with later Mesoamerican traditions. The cosmos might have been created through the sacrifice and transformation of primordial beings, whose bodies became the earth, sky, and underworld. Humans might have been created from maize, explaining the sacred nature of this crop. The first humans might have been created multiple times, with earlier, imperfect creations destroyed by floods or other catastrophes before the current creation succeeded. The concept of multiple world creations and destructions, which appears in later Mesoamerican mythology, might have originated with the Olmecs. This cyclical view of cosmic history, where worlds are created, flourish, decline, and are destroyed in recurring patterns, provided a framework for understanding both cosmic and human history. The monuments and offerings buried at Olmec sites might have been intended to survive world destructions, carrying information or spiritual power into future creations. The role of ancestors in Olmec religion was probably significant, though less archaeologically visible than deity worship. The colossal heads, portraits of deceased rulers, might have served as more than memorials. They might have been understood as continuing presences of these rulers, who maintained influence over their descendants and territories after death. Offerings made to these monuments might have been intended to sustain the deceased rulers in the afterlife, or to request their intervention in earthly affairs. The Olmec concept of the soul or life force was probably complex, possibly involving multiple souls with different characteristics and fates after death. Later Mesoamerican cultures believed in multiple souls, one that travelled to the afterlife, another that remained near the body or could be reborn, and others with different qualities and destinations. The Olmecs might have held similar beliefs, which would explain the various treatments of the dead found at their sites, from simple burials to elaborate tombs to secondary reburials where bones were moved and rearranged. Dreams and visions played important roles in Olmec religious practice. The numerous depictions of closed or half-closed eyes in Olmec art might represent dream states or visionary experiences. Certain individuals might have been recognized as especially gifted dreamers or vision seekers, serving as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The interpretation of dreams and visions required specialized knowledge, creating roles for religious specialists who could decode the messages received during these altered states. Music and dance were integral to Olmec ritual practice, though the archaeological evidence is limited due to the perishability of most musical instruments. Ceramic whistles, ocarinas, and drums have been found at Olmec sites. Turtle shells used as drums, conch shell trumpets, and wooden flutes probably existed but haven't survived. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of much ritual music would have helped induce trance states necessary for spiritual transformation. Dance, depicted in some Olmec figurines, would have been another technique for achieving altered consciousness through physical exhaustion and rhythmic movements. The use of masks in Olmec ritual is evidenced by numerous ceramic and stone masks found at various sites. These masks might have been worn during ceremonies to represent deities, ancestors, or mythological beings. Wearing a mask wasn't just disguise but transformation. The wearer became the being represented by the mask. Jade masks found in elite burials might have been intended to transform the deceased into divine beings in the afterlife. The production of these masks required not just technical skill, but religious knowledge about the proper representation of supernatural beings. Pilgrimage to sacred sites was probably an important aspect of Olmec religious life. Certain locations, springs, caves, mountain peaks, or places where important mythological events were believed to have occurred, would have attracted pilgrims from throughout the Olmec region and beyond. The offerings found at sites like El Manatee Spring suggest that people travelled considerable distances to make offerings at particularly sacred locations. These pilgrimages would have reinforced shared religious beliefs, while also facilitating economic and cultural exchange. The relationship between political power and religious authority in Olmec society was intimate and mutually reinforcing. Rulers weren't just political leaders, but religious specialists who performed essential rituals maintaining cosmic order. Their ability to transform into jaguars, communicate with ancestors and deities, and ensure agricultural fertility through proper rituals legitimized their political authority. Conversely, political power provided the resources necessary for elaborate religious ceremonies, monument construction, and support of religious specialists. The artistic legacy of the Olmecs represents one of humanity's great creative achievements, a tradition that established aesthetic principles and symbolic languages that would influence art throughout Mesoamerica for 3,000 years. From monumental basalt sculptures weighing dozens of tons to delicate jade figurines small enough to hold in one hand. From elaborate architectural complexes covering hundreds of acres to intricate designs carved on pottery vessels, Olmec artists worked in every medium available to them with technical mastery and creative vision that still inspires awe today. The development of Olmec artistic style didn't happen in isolation, but emerged from the intersection of local traditions, innovative techniques, and possibly influences from distant regions. The distinctive features that we recognize as Olmec, the downturned mouths, the almond-shaped eyes, the emphasis on transformation and duality, developed over centuries of experimentation and refinement. Early Olmec art shows more variation and experimentation, while later periods show increasing standardization and codification of forms, suggesting the development of formal artistic canons transmitted through workshop traditions. The workshops where Olmec art was produced were centers of innovation and learning where master artists passed their knowledge to apprentices through years of training. Learning to carve jade or basalt wasn't just acquiring technical skills, but understanding the religious and cultural significance of every motif, the proper ways to represent deities and rulers, the symbolic meanings of different materials and colours. An apprentice might spend years learning to polish stone before being allowed to attempt carving. Only after demonstrating complete mastery of technique would an artist be permitted to create important religious or political monuments. The tools available to Olmec artists were simple, by modern standards, but used with incredible skill. For working basalt and other hard stones, they used hammerstones of even harder material, slowly pecking away stone to create rough forms. Chisels made from jade or other hard stones were used for finer work. Abrasives ranging from coarse sand to fine clay were used for polishing, a process that could take months for a single sculpture. String saws, cords embedded with abrasive material, were used to cut jade and other hard stones. Tubular drills, possibly made from hollow reeds or bird bones with abrasive sand, created circular depressions and perforations. The techniques for working different materials required specialized knowledge. Jade, one of the hardest natural materials, couldn't be chipped like obsidian but had to be slowly ground away. Understanding jade's grain structure, where it would break and where it would hold, took years of experience. Different types of jade, jadeite, nephrite, and various serpentines the Olmecs also used, each had different properties requiring adjusted techniques. The final polishing of jade to achieve the lustrous finish seen in Olmec pieces required patience and skill that few modern artists could match. The symbolic significance of materials in Olmec art went beyond their physical properties. Jade's green colour associated it with water, vegetation, and life itself. Its hardness and durability made it appropriate for objects intended to last forever, carrying power and meaning into the afterlife or future worlds. Basalt, volcanic stone, born from the Earth's fiery interior, was appropriate for monuments connecting the underworld with the earthly realm. Obsidian, volcanic glass that could be worked to incredible sharpness, had associations with sacrifice, warfare, and the cutting of boundaries between worlds. The iconographic system developed by Olmec artists was complex and multi-layered, with symbols operating on multiple levels of meaning. A jaguar mouth might simultaneously represent the entrance to a cave, the jaws of the earth monster, the moment of shamanic transformation, and the political authority of a ruler who could transform into a jaguar. This multiplicity of meaning wasn't confusion, but intentional complexity, allowing artworks to communicate different messages to different audiences and to reveal deeper meanings through contemplation and ritual engagement. The representation of the human form in Olmec art shows sophisticated understanding of anatomy combined with intentional stylization for symbolic purposes. The colossal heads demonstrate that Olmec artists could achieve remarkable naturalism when desired, capturing individual features with portrait-like accuracy. But most Olmec human representations show deliberate departures from naturalism, elongated skulls from cranial deformation, downturned mouths suggesting jaguar transformation, eyes with epicanthic folds emphasized beyond natural occurrence. These stylizations weren't failures of observation, but choices that communicated cultural values and spiritual concepts. The treatment of space and composition in Olmec art reveals sophisticated aesthetic principles. Monuments weren't created as isolated objects, but as elements in larger compositions. The arrangement of colossal heads, altars, and stelae at sites like La Venta created visual narratives that unfolded as viewers moved through space. The relationship between positive and negative space in relief carvings shows understanding of how absence could be as meaningful as presence. The use of multiple viewpoints in single compositions, showing figures simultaneously from front and profile, anticipated techniques that wouldn't appear in European art until the 20th century. The development of writing among the Olmecs represents one of their most significant intellectual achievements, though our inability to fully decipher their script limits our understanding. The earliest Olmec symbols that might represent writing appear on pottery and monuments from the Middle Formative period. These symbols go beyond simple pictorial representation to function as conventional signs with standardized meanings. The Cascajal block, with its 62 symbols arranged in horizontal rows, strongly suggests true writing, though without bilingual texts or longer inscriptions, decipherment remains elusive. The relationship between Olmec writing and later Mesoamerican scripts is complex and debated. Some symbols that appear in Olmec contexts clearly anticipate signs used in Maya and other later writing systems. The bar and dot numerical notation used by the Maya appears in Olmec contexts. Calendar glyphs that might represent day names or months show similarities to later systems. But whether Olmec writing was a direct ancestor of later scripts or one of several experiments in writing that influenced each other remains uncertain. The intellectual achievement represented by writing goes beyond the script itself to include the conceptual breakthroughs necessary for its development. Writing requires the understanding that spoken language can be represented visually, that arbitrary symbols can carry meaning, that symbols can be combined to create new meanings. It requires standardization so that symbols mean the same thing to different readers. It requires teaching methods to transmit literacy across generations. The Olmecs achieved all of this, creating a technology that would transform human culture. Mathematical concepts developed by the Olmecs laid the foundation for later Mesoamerican achievements in astronomy, architecture, and calendar systems. The vigesimal system, based on units of 20, was fully developed during the Olmec period. This system, more efficient than decimal systems for certain calculations, allowed for complex mathematical operations. The concept of place notation, where a symbol's position determines its value, was understood and used. Most remarkably, the Olmecs might have developed the concept of zero as a placeholder, one of the crucial mathematical innovations in human history. The practical applications of Olmec mathematics extended beyond abstract calculation. Architectural planning required understanding of geometry and proportion. The precise orientation of buildings required astronomical calculations. The movement of massive stones required calculation of weights, forces and distances. The creation of calendar systems required understanding of astronomical cycles and mathematical relationships. Trade and tribute systems required accounting methods. All of these practical needs drove mathematical innovation, while mathematical advances enabled new achievements in other fields. Astronomical observations by the Olmecs reached levels of precision that rival modern measurements made without telescopes. They tracked the solar year at 365 days, understanding that it was actually slightly longer and possibly making periodic adjustments. They observed the cycles of the moon, probably recognizing the relationship between lunar phases and tides. They tracked Venus through its complex cycle as morning and evening star, disappearing and reappearing in patterns that would become central to Mesoamerican astronomy. They might have predicted eclipses, using these dramatic events to demonstrate the power of their priest astronomers. The orientation of Olmec buildings and monuments shows deliberate alignment with astronomical phenomena. Some structures align with sunrise or sunset on solstices or equinoxes. Others might align with the rising or setting of particular stars or constellations. These alignments weren't just symbolic but functional, turning architecture into astronomical instruments that marked important dates and tracked celestial cycles. The knowledge required to achieve these precise alignments, understanding of celestial mechanics, ability to make accurate observations, mathematical skills to calculate angles and positions, represents sophisticated scientific achievement. The development of the long count calendar, evidenced at sites like Tres Zapotes, represents a conceptual breakthrough in how humans think about time. Rather than relying solely on repeating cycles, the long count created a linear progression that could precisely date events thousands of years in the past or future. This system required understanding of large numbers, complex calculations involving multiple cycles, and abstract thinking about temporal relationships. The intellectual sophistication required to develop and use such a system places Olmec scholars among the great thinkers of the ancient world. The preservation and transmission of knowledge in Olmec society required institutional structures and practices that we can only partially reconstruct. There must have been schools or apprenticeship systems where young people learned specialized knowledge. There might have been libraries or archives where information was stored, possibly in books made from bark paper that haven't survived. There were certainly oral traditions that preserved history, mythology, and practical knowledge across generations. The standardization of artistic styles, architectural techniques, and religious practices across the Olmec region suggests effective methods for transmitting complex cultural information. The influence of Olmec intellectual achievements on later Mesoamerican civilizations cannot be overstated. The Maya calendar, one of the most accurate calendar systems ever developed, built on Olmec foundations. The writing systems of the Maya, Zapotec, and other cultures show clear connections to Olmec symbolic systems. Mathematical concepts first developed by the Olmecs enabled architectural and astronomical achievements throughout Mesoamerica. Artistic styles and iconographic conventions established by the Olmecs influenced art for 3,000 years. The rhythm of daily life in Olmec society varied dramatically depending on one's position in the social hierarchy, the season of the year, and the specific community where one lived. From the first light of dawn, when farmers headed to their fields, until late at night when priests performed rituals by torchlight, Olmec communities buzzed with activity. The image of ancient life as simple or primitive dissolves when we examine the complex economic systems, sophisticated crafts, elaborate social networks, and rich cultural traditions that shaped everyday experience in the Olmec world. A typical farming family living near San Lorenzo or La Venta would wake before dawn to the sound of howler monkeys greeting the approaching day. The house, a rectangular structure of poles and thatch raised on a low-earth platform, would shelter an extended family: grandparents, parents, children, perhaps unmarried aunts or uncles. The packed earth floor would be swept clean each morning, a task usually performed by women or girls. Sleeping mats woven from palm fronds or other plant fibres would be rolled up and stored. The hearth, 3 stones arranged to support cooking vessels, would be rekindled from carefully preserved coals. Breakfast preparation began immediately, with women grinding soaked corn on stone matats to produce the dough for tortillas. This grinding, which could take hours for a large family, was accompanied by rhythmic songs that helped maintain the proper pace and pressure. The sound of grinding stones would echo through the village as every household prepared the day's food. Beans that had been soaking overnight would be set to cook in ceramic pots. Chili peppers, both fresh and dried, would be prepared for sauces. If the family was fortunate, there might be eggs from domesticated turkeys or ducks, fish caught the previous day, or meat from hunting. While women prepared food, men would outready their tools for the day's work. During the agricultural season, this meant checking digging sticks, stone axes, and obsidian knives. Gourds for carrying water and food would be filled. Bags woven from plant fibres would be loaded with seeds for planting or containers for harvest. The walk to the fields might take an hour or more, as agricultural plots were often located at some distance from settlements to access the best soils or to allow fields near the village to lie fallow and recover fertility. The agricultural work itself varied by season. During the dry season, men would clear new fields using slash-and-burn techniques. carefully controlling fires to prevent them from spreading beyond intended areas. The ash from burned vegetation enriched the soil with nutrients. During planting season, usually coinciding with the first rains, entire families would work together, making holes with digging sticks and dropping in seeds of corn, beans, and squash. The Three Sisters agriculture system, where these three crops grew together in mutual support, required careful spacing and timing to optimize yields. Weeding during the growing season was constant work, as tropical vegetation grew rapidly in the humid climate. Men, women, and children, old enough to distinguish crops from weeds, would work the fields, carefully removing competing plants while avoiding damage to crops. This work was often done in the cooler morning and evening hours, with midday rest during the hottest period. Songs, stories, and jokes helped pass the time during these repetitive tasks. Knowledge about plants, soils, weather patterns, and agricultural techniques was transmitted during these shared work sessions. The harvest season brought intense activity as crops had to be gathered quickly once ripe to prevent loss to weather, animals, or decay. Corn ears were picked, husked, and dried. Beans were collected in baskets and spread to dry. Squash was harvested and either consumed fresh or processed for storage. The success or failure of the harvest determined whether the coming year would bring plenty or hardship. Surplus production might be traded for other goods or given as tribute to rulers. Failed harvests meant hunger, debt, and possibly migration to find food. Beyond agriculture, farming families engaged in numerous other subsistence activities. Fishing in rivers and lagoons provided protein and variety in the diet. Men used various techniques: nets for small fish, spears or harpoons for larger ones, traps for catching fish in shallow waters. Women and children gathered shellfish from riverbanks and lagoons. During certain seasons, when fish concentrated in specific locations, entire communities might participate in large-scale fishing expeditions, with the catch preserved through smoking or salting for later consumption. Hunting supplemented the diet with meat and provided materials for tools and clothing. Men hunted individually or in small groups, using spears, atlatls, and possibly blowguns. Deer were prized for both meat and hides. Peccaries, similar to wild pigs, provided meat and bristles useful for various purposes. Tapirs, the largest land animals in the region, were occasionally taken, providing large amounts of meat. Smaller animals, rabbits, armadillos, iguanas, were caught using traps and snares. Gathering wild plants remained important despite agricultural development. Women and children knew dozens of edible plants and when and where to find them. Wild fruits, nuts, roots, and greens supplemented the diet, especially during seasons when cultivated crops were scarce. Medicinal plants were gathered by specialists who knew their properties and proper preparation. Materials for construction, crafts, and tools came from the forest: palm fronds for thatch, vines for rope, hardwoods for building, resins for adhesive, and incense. The household production of basic goods occupied much time, especially for women. Pottery making, while specialized production existed for fine wares, was also a household activity for utilitarian vessels. Women would gather clay from specific sources, prepare it by removing impurities and adding temper, shape vessels by hand or using molds, and fire them in open fires or simple kilns. The decoration of pottery, even simple household wares, shows artistic sensibility and cultural expression. Motifs passed down through generations appeared on water jars, cooking pots, and storage vessels. Textile production was another major household activity, though little direct evidence survives due to poor preservation in tropical climates. Cotton was grown, harvested, cleaned, and spun into thread using spindle whirls. The thread was dyed using various plant and mineral sources: indigo for blue, cochineal insects for red, various plants for yellows and browns. Weaving on backstrap looms produced cloth for clothing, bags, and other uses. The patterns woven into textiles carried social and symbolic meanings, identifying the wearer's community, status, and possibly ritual associations. The social organisation of Olmec communities extended beyond individual households to include larger kin groups and neighbourhood associations. Extended families often lived in clusters of houses, sharing resources and labour. These kin groups might have controlled specific agricultural lands, passing them down through generations. Marriage patterns, while not fully understood, probably involved rules about which groups could intermarry, creating alliances between families. These kinship networks provided social security, helping members during illness, crop failure, or other hardships. The division of labour by gender and age structured daily activities, though these divisions weren't absolute. Men typically did the heavy agricultural work, hunting and construction. Women usually prepared food, made pottery and textiles, and cared for young children. But women also participated in planting and harvesting, while men helped with food preparation during busy periods. Children began contributing to household labour at young ages with tasks appropriate to their strength and skill. Elderly people, repositories of knowledge and experience, taught younger generations, performed lighter tasks, and often served as ritual specialists or healers. The market days that occurred in larger Olmec centres would have been major events in the social calendar. Families would wake even earlier than usual, loading trade goods onto their backs or into canoes for the journey to market. Women might carry pottery vessels, textiles, or prepared foods. Men might bring agricultural surplus, hunted game, or craft products. Children old enough to walk would help carry smaller items. The journey itself was a social occasion, with families from different villages meeting on the paths and waterways, exchanging news and gossip. The markets themselves were probably held in large plazas near ceremonial centres, transforming these sacred spaces into bustling commercial hubs. Vendors would arrange their goods on mats or cloths spread on the ground. The air would fill with voices haggling over prices, vendors calling out their wares, and friends greeting each other. The smells of cooking food, fresh produce, and various materials would create a sensory feast. These markets weren't just economic exchanges, but social gatherings where marriages were arranged, alliances formed, and information transmitted across the region. The items available at these markets reveal the complexity of the Olmec economy. Local products like corn, beans, squash, and other foodstuffs form the bulk of trade. But exotic items from distant regions were also available: jade from Guatemala, obsidian from the highlands, shells from distant coasts, colourful feathers from tropical birds. These luxury items were probably restricted to elite purchasers, or required special arrangements to obtain. The media of exchange might have included cacao beans, jade beads, or other standardized valuable items, though much trade was probably conducted through barter. Craft specialists occupied an intermediate position in Olmec society between farmers and elites. These artisans, potters, stoneworkers, textile producers, and others might have worked full-time at their crafts or combined craft production with farming. Some probably worked independently, producing goods for market exchange. Others might have been attached to elite households or ceremonial centres, producing luxury goods and ritual objects on commission. The workshops where these specialists laboured have been identified at some sites, showing concentrated areas of production debris and specialised tools. The training of craft specialists began in childhood through apprenticeship, often within families where skills were passed from parent to child. Learning to work jade or obsidian required years of practice to develop the necessary hand-eye coordination and understanding of materials. Apprentices would start with simple tasks, preparing materials, maintaining tools, polishing finished pieces. Gradually, They would be allowed to attempt more complex work under close supervision. Only after demonstrating mastery would they be permitted to create important pieces or develop their own styles. The life of elite families differed dramatically from that of commoners. Elite children underwent cranial deformation in infancy, their soft skulls bound to create the elongated shape that marked high status throughout life. They probably received formal education in history, mythology, ritual practice, and possibly writing and mathematics. Elite boys might have trained in warfare and leadership. Elite girls might have learned complex textile techniques, ritual knowledge, and the management of large households. Both would have participated in elaborate ceremonies that reinforced their special status. Elite residences, though few have been fully excavated, were larger and more elaborate than common houses. They might have had stone foundations, plastered walls, and multiple rooms for different functions. Elite families had servants or slaves to perform manual labour, allowing them to focus on governance, ritual, and leisure activities. Their diet included a wider variety of foods, including rare delicacies and specially prepared dishes. They wore elaborate clothing, made from fine textiles, adorned themselves with jade jewellery and other precious materials, and had access to exotic goods from across Mesoamerica. The religious duties of elites structured much of their daily life. Rulers and high nobles performed public rituals that were believed essential for maintaining cosmic order. These might include bloodletting ceremonies where they pierced their tongues, earlobes, or genitals to offer blood to the gods. They participated in elaborate festivals that could last days, involving fasting, purification, costume changes, and complex choreographed performances. They consulted calendars and divination to determine auspicious times for various activities. The boundary between political and religious authority was blurred or non-existent. Priests and religious specialists formed another distinct social group with their own daily routines and obligations. They maintained the temples and sacred spaces, ensuring ritual purity through cleaning, censing with copal incense, and performing daily offerings. They observed astronomical phenomena to maintain calendars and predict celestial events. They preserved and transmitted religious knowledge through oral tradition and possibly written texts. They performed divination for both elites and commoners, interpreting dreams, reading signs in natural phenomena, and consulting sacred books or objects. The education and training of priests was probably long and rigorous. Young people selected for religious service might have been identified through birth dates, physical characteristics, or demonstrated spiritual sensitivity. They would have undergone years of training in mythology, ritual practice, calendar systems, astronomy, and possibly writing. They might have practiced extreme asceticism, fasting, sleep deprivation, bloodletting, to develop their spiritual powers. The knowledge they acquired was carefully guarded, creating a religious elite with exclusive access to certain types of information and power. Warriors, while not a separate class in the same way as later Aztec society, played important roles in Olmec communities. Young men probably received basic military training as part of their education. During conflicts, farmers would be mobilized as soldiers, bringing their own weapons and supplies. Professional or semi-professional warriors might have existed, attached to rulers as guards and enforcers. Success in warfare could provide social mobility, with captured enemies providing prestige and possibly wealth through ransom or slave labour. The conduct of warfare in Olmec society probably followed ritual conventions as well as practical considerations. Battles might have been preceded by negotiations, challenges, and ceremonies. The capture of enemies for sacrifice might have been more important than killing in battle. Certain times of year might have been designated for warfare, avoiding conflicts during crucial agricultural periods. The weapons used, spears, clubs, atlatls, required close combat, making warfare a very personal and dangerous activity. Slavery existed in Olmec society, though its extent and nature are debated. War captives might have been enslaved, at least temporarily. People might have become slaves through debt or as criminal punishment. Children might have been sold into slavery by impoverished parents. Slaves probably performed the hardest and most dangerous labour: construction projects, mining, possibly human sacrifice. But slavery might not have been permanent or hereditary, with possibilities for manumission through various means. The treatment of illness and injury in Olmec society combined practical medicine with spiritual healing. Healers possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants and their preparation. They could set broken bones, as evidenced by healed fractures in skeletal remains. They performed dental work, including tooth extraction and possibly filling cavities. They might have performed surgery, including trepanation, removing portions of the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits. But healing also involved ritual practices: prayers, offerings, spiritual cleansing, addressing the supernatural causes of illness. The knowledge of medicinal plants was probably specialized, with certain individuals or families maintaining this information across generations. Hundreds of plants in the Olmec region have medicinal properties, and the Olmecs probably knew and used many of them. Plants for reducing fever, controlling pain, fighting infection, aiding digestion, and treating numerous other conditions would have been gathered, prepared, and administered according to traditional recipes. This botanical knowledge represented centuries of experimentation and observation, a scientific tradition that paralleled religious healing practices. Entertainment and leisure, while limited for common people who worked constantly for survival, still played important roles in Olmec life. Music and dance were probably common at festivals and family celebrations. Storytelling around evening fires preserved history and mythology while entertaining listeners. Games, including the ritual bull game but also simpler diversions, provided recreation. Children played with toys, wheeled animals, whistles, miniature vessels that have been found at Olmec sites. Adults might have gambled on various games of chance or skill. The bull game, while having deep religious significance, was also entertainment and sport. Not every game was a cosmic drama with life and death stakes. Informal games might have been played in vacant lots or fields, with players of various skill levels participating. Watching skilled players compete would have been exciting entertainment, with spectators probably wagering on outcomes. The production of rubber balls itself was a specialized craft, requiring knowledge of latex processing that was probably closely guarded. The seasonal cycle of festivals and ceremonies punctuated the routine of daily life with periods of intense celebration and ritual activity. These festivals might have celebrated agricultural milestones, planting, first fruits, harvest. They might have commemorated mythological events or historical victories. They might have marked astronomical phenomena, solstices, equinoxes, eclipses. During these festivals, normal social rules might have been relaxed or reversed. Work stopped, markets closed, and entire communities participated in processions, dances, feasts, and rituals. The preparation for major festivals would have occupied communities for weeks or months in advance. Special foods had to be prepared, requiring gathering ingredients and elaborate cooking. Costumes and masks had to be made or refurbished. Ritual objects had to be created or cleaned. Performance spaces had to be prepared. Participants had to rehearse songs, dances, and dramatic performances. These preparations were probably as important as the festivals themselves in creating community solidarity and transmitting cultural traditions. The decline of Olmec civilization wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation that unfolded over several centuries, beginning around 400 BCE and continuing until Olmec culture as a distinct entity ceased to exist around 200 CE. This transformation wasn't uniform across the Olmec region. Some sites were abandoned rapidly, while others continued to be occupied for centuries. Some traditions disappeared, while others evolved into new forms. Some populations dispersed, while others remained in place but adopted new cultural identities. Understanding this complex process requires examining multiple factors: environmental, social, political, and ideological, that interacted in ways we're still trying to understand. The environmental challenges facing the Olmec heartland by 400 BCE were substantial and growing. Centuries of intensive agriculture had depleted soils in many areas, reducing crop yields and requiring farmers to travel farther to find productive land. The slash-and-burn agriculture that had sustained Olmec populations worked well when population density was low and land was abundant. But as populations grew and available land decreased, the system became increasingly unsustainable. Fields couldn't be left fallow long enough to fully recover fertility, leading to declining productivity and eventual abandonment. Deforestation around major centres had reached critical levels by the late formative period. The construction of massive earthen monuments required not just earth but also enormous quantities of wood, for scaffolding, ramps and fuel for burning limestone to make plaster. Daily cooking fires for thousands of people consumed forests of firewood. The clearing of land for agriculture removed even more forest cover. As forests disappeared, erosion increased, washing precious topsoil into rivers and leaving behind less productive land. The local climate might have been affected, with deforestation potentially reducing rainfall and increasing temperature extremes. The rivers that were lifelines for Olmec civilization were changing in ways that disrupted established patterns of settlement and subsistence. Increased erosion from deforested hillsides filled rivers with sediment, causing them to change course unpredictably. Areas that had been prime riverside agricultural land might suddenly find themselves far from water. Harbours and landing places for canoes might become inaccessible. The flooding patterns that farmers had learned to predict and exploit over generations became erratic and destructive. These hydrological changes would have been particularly devastating for a civilization that depended heavily on water transport and riverine resources. The flooding patterns that farmers had learned to predict and exploit over generations became erratic and destructive. These hydrological changes would have been particularly devastating for a civilization that depended heavily on water transport and riverine resources. Climate change might have played a role in Olmec decline, though the evidence is debated among scholars. Some data suggests that the period around 400 BCE saw decreased rainfall in parts of Mesoamerica, possibly related to larger global climate patterns. Even small decreases in rainfall could have had major impacts on agriculture, especially in areas already stressed by soil depletion and deforestation. Droughts would have been particularly devastating for populations concentrated around ceremonial centres, who depended on agricultural surpluses from surrounding areas. Failed harvests would have undermined the tribute system that supported elite activities and monumental construction. The social tensions within Olmec society might have reached breaking points during this period of environmental stress. The gap between elites and commoners had probably widened over centuries, with rulers demanding ever more elaborate monuments and ceremonies, while farmers struggled with declining productivity. The labour demands for construction projects might have interfered with agricultural work, creating food shortages that affected commoners more than elites who controlled stored surpluses. The ideological justifications for elite rule, their ability to ensure cosmic order and agricultural fertility through ritual, would have been undermined by environmental crises they couldn't prevent or resolve. Evidence for internal conflict at Olmec sites increases during the late formative period. At San Lorenzo, La Venta, and other sites, monuments were deliberately defaced or destroyed. The pattern of destruction, targeting faces and symbols of power while leaving monuments partially intact, suggests not random vandalism, but deliberate acts of desecration aimed at neutralizing the supernatural power of these objects. This might represent internal rebellions against rulers, conflicts between competing elite factions, or ritual killing of monuments as part of dynastic changes or site abandonments. The rise of competing power centers throughout Mesoamerica challenged Olmec hegemony and disrupted established trade networks. In the Maya lowlands, sites like El Mirador and Nakbe were growing into major centers with their own monumental architecture and artistic traditions. In the valley of Oaxaca, Monte Alban was emerging as a powerful state with its own writing system and political organization. In central Mexico, Cuicuilco and later Teotihuacan were developing into urban centers that would dominate their regions. These emerging powers competed with Olmec centers for resources, trade routes, and ideological influence. The changing nature of trade relationships affected Olmec prosperity and cultural influence. Earlier, Olmec centers had controlled access to certain precious materials and the knowledge to work them. But by the late formative period, jade working techniques had spread throughout Mesoamerica. Obsidian trade routes had multiplied, and local traditions of monumental art had developed in many regions. Olmec centers no longer monopolized prestige goods or sacred knowledge. Their role as intermediaries in long-distance trade diminished as direct relationships developed between other regions. The ideological foundations of Olmec civilization were being questioned and transformed. The Were-Jaguar transformation complex, so central to Olmec religion, was being replaced or supplemented by new deities and concepts. Feathered serpents, rain gods with goggle eyes, and other supernatural beings that would become central to classic period religions were gaining prominence. The shamanic kingship model of the Olmecs, where rulers personally transformed and travelled between worlds, was giving way to more institutionalized forms of religious authority with professional priesthoods and elaborate temple institutions. The spread of writing and calendar systems, ironically one of the Olmecs' great contributions, might have undermined their special status as keepers of sacred knowledge. As literacy spread, local traditions could be recorded and preserved without reference to Olmec authority. Local histories could be written that didn't acknowledge Olmec precedents. Calendar systems could be adjusted to local needs without consulting Olmec specialists. The democratization of knowledge that writing enabled reduced the Olmecs' monopoly on certain types of intellectual and spiritual authority. Population movements during this period reshaped the ethnic and linguistic landscape of the Olmec region. Some groups might have migrated out of the heartland, seeking better opportunities elsewhere, carrying Olmec traditions to new regions, where they evolved in different directions. Other groups might have moved into former Olmec territories, bringing their own languages and customs. The ethnic identity, Olmec, if it ever existed as a unified identity, fragmented into multiple groups with different trajectories. Some might have maintained Olmec traditions for generations, while others quickly adopted new identities and affiliations. The archaeological evidence for the late and terminal formative periods shows tremendous variability in how different Olmec communities experienced this transformation. Some sites, like Tres Zapotes, continued to thrive and even grew during this period, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining certain Olmec traditions. Others, like La Venta, were largely abandoned, with only small populations remaining to tend shrines or maintain minimal occupation. Still others show evidence of violent destruction followed by reoccupation by groups with different material culture, suggesting population replacement rather than cultural continuity. The monumental construction that had characterized Olmec civilization largely ceased during this period, but this doesn't necessarily indicate complete collapse. The resources and labor that had gone into building pyramids and carving colossal heads might have been redirected to other activities, intensifying agriculture to deal with environmental challenges, military activities to defend against competitors, or trade expeditions to maintain economic connections. The absence of monuments might reflect changing priorities rather than inability to create them. The transformation of Olmec art during this period shows creative adaptation rather than simple decline. While the production of colossal heads ceased, new forms of sculpture emerged. Stelae with narrative scenes became more common, possibly reflecting influence from the Maya area. Ceramic traditions evolved in new directions, with some regions developing distinctive local styles, while others maintained Olmec conventions. The rigid iconographic canon of middle formative Olmec art gave way to more varied and experimental forms, suggesting artistic freedom rather than cultural decay. The role of warfare in Olmec decline and transformation is evidenced by increased fortifications at some sites and the prevalence of military themes in art. Competition for declining resources might have led to endemic warfare between communities that had previously coexisted peacefully. Raids for captives to sacrifice might have depopulated vulnerable areas. The disruption of agricultural work by military conflicts would have exacerbated food shortages. The costs of defense, building fortifications, maintaining warriors, losing productive labor to military service would have strained community resources. Disease might have played a role in Olmec decline, though direct evidence is limited. The concentration of populations at ceremonial centers would have facilitated disease transmission. Malnutrition from agricultural problems would have increased susceptibility to infections. Trade contacts with distant regions might have introduced new diseases to which Olmec populations had no immunity. The tropical environment of the Olmec heartland harboured numerous pathogens and disease vectors. Epidemic diseases could have caused rapid population declines that disrupted social and economic systems. The religious and philosophical responses to crisis during this period might have accelerated cultural transformation. If traditional rituals failed to prevent environmental and social disasters, people might have questioned the efficacy of established religious practices. New religious movements might have emerged, promising better outcomes through different beliefs and practices. Conversion to new religious systems might have been seen as necessary for survival. The abandonment of old gods and adoption of new ones would have fundamentally altered cultural identity. The question of what happened to the Olmec people themselves has multiple answers. Some certainly remained in their ancestral territories, adapting to new circumstances and eventually being absorbed into other cultural traditions. Others migrated to different regions, carrying Olmec knowledge and customs that influenced local cultures. The genetic legacy of the Olmecs persists in modern populations of southern Mexico, even if their cultural identity has long since transformed. The languages they spoke evolved into modern Mixozoquian languages, still spoken in the region. The transformation of specific sites illustrates the varied trajectories of Olmec decline. At La Venta, the Great Pyramid and ceremonial structures were abandoned by 400 BCE, but small populations continued to live among the ruins for centuries. They made offerings at old shrines, suggesting continued reverence for the sacred places, if not the political system that created them. At San Lorenzo, reoccupation after abandonment shows that the site retained importance even after its political power ended. At Tres Zapotes, Continued occupation and monument production into the Common Era shows successful adaptation to changing circumstances. The economic adaptations of post-Olmec communities reveal resilience and innovation. With long-distance trade networks disrupted, communities focused more on local production and regional exchange. New craft traditions emerged that combined Olmec techniques with influences from other cultures. Agricultural practices diversified, with greater emphasis on root crops, tree cultivation, and other alternatives to maize agriculture. Fishing and hunting might have become more important as agricultural yields declined. These adaptations allowed populations to survive even as the political and religious superstructure of Olmec civilization disappeared. The end of Olmec civilization as a distinct cultural entity didn't mean the end of Olmec influence. Like seeds scattered by wind, Olmec ideas, innovations, and traditions spread throughout Mesoamerica, taking root in different soils and growing into new forms. Every major civilization that followed, Maya, Zapotec, Teotihuacan, Toltec, Aztec, built upon foundations the Olmecs had laid. Understanding Mesoamerican civilization without acknowledging this Olmec heritage would be like trying to understand Western civilization without recognizing Greek and Roman contributions. The Maya, who created perhaps the most sophisticated civilization of ancient America, were profoundly influenced by Olmec precedents. The earliest Maya sites show clear Olmec influence in their art, architecture, and religious symbolism. The Maya calendar system, one of their greatest achievements, built directly on Olmec innovations. The long count calendar that allowed the Maya to record historical dates with precision was probably an Olmec invention, as evidenced by early dates at Tres Zapotes. The 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar calendar, fundamental to Maya timekeeping, have Olmec origins. Maya writing, the most fully developed script in ancient America, shows connections to Olmec symbol systems. While we cannot read Olmec inscriptions, the symbols they used anticipate many Maya glyphs. The combination of logographic and syllabic elements that characterizes Maya writing might have been pioneered by the Olmecs. The Maya practice of recording historical events, astronomical observations, and religious texts on stone monuments continues Olmec traditions of public inscription. Even specific Maya glyphs can sometimes be traced back to Olmec prototypes. The Maya concept of divine kingship bears striking similarities to Olmec precedents. Maya rulers, like their Olmec predecessors, claim the ability to communicate with supernatural forces and travel between cosmic realms. They performed bloodletting rituals that the Olmecs had practiced centuries earlier. They commissioned portrait monuments that, while stylistically different from Olmec colossal heads, served similar functions in legitimizing royal authority. The Maya ball game, with its cosmic symbolism and ritual significance, elaborated on traditions the Olmecs had established. Maya art, despite its distinctive style, reveals Olmec influence in themes and iconography. The jaguar transformation complex, so central to Olmec religion, appears in Maya art, with jaguar gods and shamanic transformation prominent in Maya mythology. The world tree that connects the three levels of the Maya cosmos has precedence in Olmec art. The Maya maize god, fundamental to Maya religion, might derive from Olmec agricultural deities. Even specific artistic conventions, the representation of breath as scrolls, the depiction of caves as monster mouths, have Olmec origins. The great Maya city of El Mirador, which flourished during the late pre-classic period when Olmec civilization was transforming, shows particular evidence of Olmec influence. The massive triadic pyramid complexes at El Mirador, among the largest structures ever built by the Maya, might represent elaborations of Olmec architectural concepts. The stucco masks that decorate these pyramids, include jaguar and serpent imagery, familiar from Olmec art. The very concept of building artificial mountains to connect earth and sky continues Olmec traditions established at La Venta and other sites. Teotihuacan, the great metropolis that dominated central Mexico from 100 to 750 CE, incorporated Olmec elements, despite developing its own distinctive culture. The precise urban planning of Teotihuacan, with its grid layout and astronomical orientations, might have been influenced by Olmec precedents in site planning. The feathered serpent, one of Teotihuacan's principal deities, has possible antecedents in Olmec art. The practice of ritual burial of offerings, so important at Teotihuacan, continues Olmec traditions. Even the concept of a multi-ethnic city where diverse populations live together might have had Olmec precedents. The Zapotec civilization of Oaxaca, contemporary with the late Olmecs and possibly in direct contact with them, shows clear Olmec influence in its early phases. The danzante figures at Monte Alban, showing contorted human figures that might represent sacrificial victims or shamanic transformation, recall Olmec themes. The Zapotec calendar and writing system, while distinctive, share fundamental concepts with Olmec systems. The Zapotec practice of ancestor veneration and the importance of royal lineages echo Olmec concerns with genealogy and divine ancestry. The Aztecs, though separated from the Olmecs by more than 1,000 years, acknowledged them as ancestral predecessors. The Aztec name Olmec, meaning rubber people, shows that they recognized the Gulf Coast as the homeland of an ancient civilization. Aztec merchants called Pocteca traced their origins to the Olmec region, claiming descent from the original long-distance traders. The Aztec calendar, mythology, and religious practices, while filtered through centuries of cultural evolution, ultimately derived from traditions the Olmecs had initiated. The Aztec deity Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror associated with jaguars, night, and transformation, might represent an evolution of Olmec jaguar deities. The Aztec practice of human sacrifice, particularly the offering of children to rain gods, has disturbing parallels with Olmec practices. The Aztec ball game, with its cosmic symbolism and occasional human sacrifice, continued traditions begun by the Olmecs. Even the Aztec concept of multiple world creations and destructions might trace back to Olmec cosmology. Beyond these major civilizations, Olmec influence can be traced in numerous smaller cultures throughout Mesoamerica. The Mixtec, Huastec, Totonac, and other groups all show evidence of Olmec influence in their art, religion, or social organization. The widespread distribution of certain mythological themes, the earth monster, the cosmic tree, the feathered serpent, suggests a common Olmec source. The prevalence of jaguar imagery in cultures from Costa Rica to northern Mexico points to the spread of Olmec religious concepts. The technological innovations of the Olmecs provided foundations for all later Mesoamerican achievements. The techniques for moving and carving massive stones that the Olmecs developed were used by every subsequent civilization that built monuments. The agricultural intensification methods pioneered by the Olmecs, raised fields, terracing, forest management, were elaborated by later cultures. The long-distance trade networks established by the Olmecs created patterns of exchange that persisted for millennia. The intellectual legacy of the Olmecs shaped Mesoamerican thought for 3,000 years. The mathematical concepts they developed, place notation, the concept of zero, the vigesimal counting system, enabled the astronomical and calendrical achievements of later civilizations. The writing systems they pioneered evolved into the scripts of the Maya, Zapotec, and other cultures. The astronomical observations they began were continued and refined by subsequent civilizations, culminating in predictions of eclipses and planetary movements of remarkable accuracy. The artistic traditions established by the Olmecs influenced Mesoamerican aesthetics throughout the pre-Columbian period. The emphasis on monumental sculpture as political and religious statement continued from Olmec colossal heads through Maya stelae to Aztec monuments. The integration of architecture and sculpture to create unified sacred landscapes was pioneered by the Olmecs and elaborated by every subsequent civilization. The use of jade and other green stones as the most precious materials, more valuable than gold, was an Olmec innovation that persisted until the Spanish conquest. The religious and philosophical concepts developed by the Olmecs provided the conceptual framework for Mesoamerican spirituality. The shamanic transformation complex, the multi-level cosmos with connecting portals, the reciprocal relationship between humans and gods requiring constant ritual maintenance, all these fundamental concepts have Olmec origins. The Mesoamerican understanding of time as cyclical, of history as repeating patterns, of the present as influenced by astronomical cycles, developed from Olmec beginnings. The social and political innovations of the Olmecs influenced Mesoamerican organization for millennia. The concept of divine kingship, where rulers mediated between human and supernatural realms, was an Olmec innovation adopted by every major Mesoamerican civilization. The use of monumental art and architecture to legitimize political authority began with the Olmecs. The organization of society into hierarchical classes with distinct rights and obligations was pioneered by the Olmecs and elaborated by later cultures. The discovery and study of Olmec civilization has revolutionized our understanding of Mesoamerican history and cultural development. Before the identification of Olmec culture in the early 20th century, scholars believed Mesoamerican civilization began with the classic Maya around 250 CE. The recognition that complex civilization existed in Mesoamerica 1500 years earlier has extended the timeline of American civilization and revealed the deep historical roots of later achievements. The excavation of Olmec sites has provided crucial evidence for understanding how complex societies develop. The Olmecs represent one of only a handful of pristine civilizations, those that developed independently without significant influence from other complex societies. Studying Olmec development helps us understand the general processes through which human societies become more complex, develop social hierarchies, create monumental architecture, and establish the institutions we associate with civilization. The conservation challenges facing Olmec sites today threaten this invaluable heritage. Urban development, agricultural expansion, oil exploration, and looting destroy archaeological sites before they can be properly studied. Climate change and environmental degradation threaten to damage or destroy exposed monuments. The illegal trade in Olmec artifacts removes objects from their archaeological context, destroying information about their meaning and use. Protecting Olmec heritage requires international cooperation, local community involvement, and sustained commitment to conservation. Modern communities in the Olmec heartland maintain connections to this ancient heritage, even if the direct cultural links were broken centuries ago. Local museums preserve and display Olmec artifacts, creating pride in indigenous heritage. Communities near archaeological sites benefit from tourism while also bearing the responsibility of protecting these places. Traditional ecological knowledge preserved in these communities might derive in part from Olmec agricultural and environmental management practices. The influence of Olmec art on modern Mexican and Central American culture extends beyond archaeology and museums. Olmec motifs appear in contemporary art, from murals to sculptures to graphic design. The colossal heads have become symbols of indigenous heritage and national identity. Olmec themes inspire literature, music, and film. The mysterious nature of Olmec civilization captures popular imagination, inspiring both scholarly research and creative interpretation. The scientific techniques now being applied to study Olmec civilization are revealing new information about this ancient culture. Satellite imagery and LiDAR are discovering previously unknown sites hidden beneath jungle canopy. Chemical analysis of artifacts reveals trade routes and production techniques. DNA analysis of ancient remains provides information about population movements and relationships. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth reveals ancient diets and migration patterns. These new techniques are revolutionizing our understanding of Olmec life and culture. The questions that remain about Olmec civilization continue to drive research and discovery. We still cannot read their writing system, if indeed they had true writing. We don't know what language they spoke with certainty. We don't fully understand their political organization or the relationships between different Olmec centers. We don't know why their civilization transformed when it did, or what happened to all their people. These mysteries ensure that Olmec studies will remain a vibrant field of research for generations to come. The lessons we can learn from Olmec civilization are relevant to contemporary challenges. Their experience with environmental degradation and climate change provides warnings about the consequences of unsustainable practices. Their achievements in creating complex society without modern technology demonstrate human creativity and adaptability. Their influence on later civilizations shows how cultural innovations can have impacts lasting millennia. Their transformation and resilience in the face of challenges provides models for how societies can adapt to change while maintaining cultural identity. The spiritual and philosophical insights of the Olmecs continue to resonate in unexpected ways. Their emphasis on transformation and the fluid boundaries between categories challenges Western tendencies toward rigid classification. Their understanding of reciprocal relationships between humans and nature offers alternatives to exploitative approaches to the environment. Their integration of art, religion, and daily life provides models for more holistic ways of living. Their acceptance of multiple simultaneous realities resonates with contemporary physics and philosophy. The Olmec achievement in creating monumental art without metal tools demonstrates that technological limitations need not prevent great accomplishments. Their ability to organize large-scale projects without writing proves that complex administration can exist through other means. Their development of sophisticated astronomy and mathematics without telescopes or computers shows that careful observation and logical thinking can achieve remarkable results. Their creation of extensive trade networks without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden demonstrates human ingenuity in overcoming obstacles. The story of the Olmecs reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, but their contributions can endure long after their political structures disappear. The Olmec state no longer exists. Their cities are ruins. Their language might be extinct, but their innovations in art, science, religion, and social organization influenced every subsequent Mesoamerican civilization and continue to inspire us today. They demonstrate that no civilization exists in isolation. All build on what came before and influence what comes after in an endless chain of cultural transmission and transformation.